Victoria Lane's fingers brushed against Mark Holden's collar, and the most powerful woman in Chicago felt him stop breathing. In that frozen second, her hand steadying his crooked tie, his pulse hammering visibly at his throat, the carefully constructed walls between CEO and employee shattered like glass. What happened next would cost him everything he'd built to protect his son, trap her in a lie that would consume 6 months of their lives, and force them both to answer one devastating question. When does pretending become the most honest thing you've ever done? If you want to see how a single touch can unravel 2 carefully guarded lives, stay with me until the end. And when you do, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The morning Mark Holden's life changed forever started exactly like every other morning for the past 3 years. He woke at 5:30 to the sound of his phone alarm, careful not to disturb the small figure curled beneath dinosaur sheets in the next room. He moved through the darkness of their modest apartment with practiced silence, measuring coffee grounds by touch, waiting for the first pale light to seep through the kitchen window before he allowed himself to believe another day had actually arrived. This was the hardest part, the waiting. The moment between sleeping and living when his mind could still trick him into reaching across cold sheets for warmth that hadn't been there since the accident. 3 years, and some mornings his hand still moved before his memory caught up. Mark pressed his palms flat against the kitchen counter and counted his breaths. 1, 2, 3. Outside, Chicago was beginning its transformation from shadow to light, the skyline emerging like a promise or a threat depending on how you looked at it. He chose promise. He always chose promise. That's what you did when you had a 7-year-old son who still believed his father could fix anything. Daddy? The voice was small, uncertain, wrapped in flannel and the lingering edges of a dream. Mark turned to find Jamie standing in the hallway, his dark hair sticking up in directions that defied physics, clutching the stuffed elephant that had been his mother's last gift. The sight of his son, alive, whole, here, hit Mark the way it did every single morning, with the force of gratitude so profound it felt like pain. "Hey, buddy." Mark kept his voice soft, easy. "It's early. You okay?" Jamie nodded, but he didn't move from the doorway. "I had the dream again." Mark's chest tightened. He crossed the small kitchen in 3 strides and knelt down, bringing himself eye level with his son. "The one about Mom?" Another nod. Jamie's gray eyes, Sarah's eyes, the color of winter storms, were too serious for a 7-year-old. "She was trying to tell me something, but I couldn't hear her. The water was too loud." Mark pulled his son against his chest and held on, feeling the small heartbeat that was the reason he got up every morning, the reason he kept choosing promise over threat. "Your mom loved you more than anything in the world. You know that, right?" "I know." Jamie's voice was muffled against Mark's shoulder. "I just wish I could remember her better. It's getting harder." There it was. The quiet devastation that no parenting book prepared you for. The moment when your child voiced the fear you carried like a stone in your chest. Mark closed his eyes and let himself remember. Sarah laughing in their college apartment. Sarah pregnant and radiant. Sarah in the hospital, holding their newborn son with tears streaming down her face. Sarah in the car when the drunk driver crossed the median. "I'll tell you more stories," Mark said finally, pulling back to look at his son. "Every day. I'll tell you something new about her. Deal?" Jamie considered this with the gravity of someone negotiating a serious contract. "Deal. But can we have pancakes first?" Mark felt the smile break across his face, real, surprised, earned. "Pancakes it is. Go wash up." As Jamie scurried back toward the bathroom, Mark stood and returned to the kitchen, his movements now purposeful rather than mechanical. He pulled out the mixing bowl, the flour, the eggs. These were the moments Sarah had loved most. The ordinary magic of weekend breakfasts, the ritual of measuring and stirring, the way their small kitchen would fill with warmth and the smell of vanilla. He worked quickly, efficiently, his hands remembering what his heart sometimes forgot, that life continued, that love took new shapes, that being a father meant showing up every single day and choosing to believe that pancakes could be medicine. By the time Jamie emerged, scrubbed and dressed in his school uniform, the kitchen table was set with 2 plates, 2 glasses of orange juice, and a stack of pancakes that would have made Sarah proud. These look perfect, Jamie announced, climbing into his chair with the enthusiasm of someone who hadn't just been wrestling with memories of loss. Can I have chocolate chips tomorrow? We'll see. Mark settled across from his son, watching him attack his breakfast with single-minded focus. This was enough. This had to be enough. A quiet life, a safe life, a life where he could give his son stability even if he couldn't give him everything else. Mark Holden had learned to be content with enough. He had no way of knowing that in approximately 4 hours, Victoria Lane would touch his collar, and enough would cease to exist. The offices of Lane Enterprises occupied floors 40 through 52 of the Hancock Tower, a gleaming monument to American capitalism that Victoria's grandfather had built from nothing but ambition and ruthlessness in equal measure. Victoria had inherited both qualities, though she liked to think she'd tempered the ruthlessness with something resembling strategic compassion. She stood now in her corner office, watching the city spread out below her like a game board, and tried to remember the last time she'd felt anything resembling peace. The view should have been calming, morning light turning the lake into hammered silver, the ordered chaos of traffic flowing along Lakeshore Drive. But all Victoria felt was the familiar tightness in her chest that had become her constant companion. "You're doing it again." The voice came from the doorway, warm with amusement and concern in equal measure. Victoria turned to find Marcus Chen, her chief operating officer and closest friend since their Harvard days, leaning against the doorframe with 2 cups of coffee and an expression she recognized as determined intervention. "Doing what?" She accepted the coffee, grateful for the distraction. "Trying to solve world hunger while simultaneously planning your next board meeting and mentally redecorating the executive lounge." Marcus moved into the office, settling into one of the leather chairs facing her desk. "You know, normal people just stare out windows and think about lunch. Normal people don't run billion-dollar companies." "No, but normal people also don't develop stress-induced insomnia and survive on 4 hours of sleep and black coffee." Marcus studied her with the kind of frank assessment that made most people uncomfortable, but which Victoria had learned to value. "The board's really getting to you, aren't they?" Victoria didn't answer immediately. Instead, she moved to her desk, setting down the coffee and pulling up her calendar with practiced efficiency. Meetings stacked upon meetings, each one a careful negotiation of power and perception. The board wants stability. They want a leader who embodies the company's family values. They want you married off to Richard fucking Blackwell so they can merge with Blackwell Industries and make themselves even richer. Marcus's voice was flat, factual. "That's what this is really about, Vic. And you know it." Victoria's fingers stilled on the keyboard. Richard Blackwell III, heir to a manufacturing empire, handsome in the way expensive cologne ads promised men could be, and exactly the kind of strategic match that made board members salivate. Her father had suggested the connection 6 months ago. Her mother had orchestrated 3 dinner meetings. The board had practically drawn up the wedding invitations. "It would be good business," Victoria said carefully. "It would be a nightmare." Marcus leaned forward, his voice losing its casual edge. "Richard Blackwell collects beautiful things and gets bored with them. You're not a beautiful thing, Vic. You're a force of nature, and the day you let the board reduce you to a strategic asset is the day we all lose." Before Victoria could respond, her assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Ms. Lane, your 9 o'clock is here." Victoria glanced at her schedule, frowning. "I don't have a 9 o'clock." "It's your mother. She says it's urgent." Marcus and Victoria exchanged looks, his sympathetic, hers resigned. "Send her in," Victoria said, her voice carefully neutral, even as her stomach twisted. Constance Lane swept into the office like a force of nature dressed in Chanel, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her expression managing to convey both maternal concern and corporate strategy. She'd perfected that particular combination over 40 years of being married to one of Chicago's most powerful men. "Darling," Constance air-kissed Victoria's cheek, then nodded at Marcus. "Marcus, good to see you. Would you give us a moment?" It wasn't a question. Marcus rose smoothly, squeezing Victoria's shoulder as he passed. "I'll be in my office when you need to debrief." The door clicked shut with the finality of a trap closing. Victoria remained standing, refusing to give ground even in her own office. "Mother, what's urgent?" Constance settled into the chair Marcus had vacated, crossing her legs with elegant precision. The Blackwell engagement announcement. The board wants to move the timeline up. They're thinking a spring wedding would be ideal. It coincides with the merger vote and presents a unified front for the shareholders. Victoria felt ice slide through her veins. I haven't agreed to marry Richard. But you will. Constance's voice was gentle, which somehow made it worse. Because you're practical, darling. Because you understand what's at stake. Your father built this company, but it's grown beyond family now. The board has power, and they're using it. They want traditional values, stability, the appearance of dynasty. Richard gives you all of that. Richard gives them all of that, Victoria corrected. What does he give me? Security, influence, a partner who understands the game. Constance leaned forward slightly. Darling, I know this isn't what you imagined, but love is a luxury we can't afford at this level. Your father and I had an arrangement, Victoria finished. I know, you've told me. And it worked. We built something together. Partnership can be enough. Victoria turned back to the window, her reflection ghostly in the glass. Behind her, she could see her mother's patient expression, the set of her shoulders that said she'd wait as long as necessary for Victoria to see reason. And the terrible thing was, Victoria did see reason. She saw it clearly, the board's pressure, the shareholders' expectations, the weight of a legacy that demanded she sacrifice personal desire for corporate good. She also saw the alternative, constant battles, potential ouster, the company her grandfather built falling into the hands of people who would strip it for parts. I'll think about it, Victoria said finally. The dinner is Thursday. Constance rose, smoothing her skirt. Richard's been very patient, but he'll want an answer soon. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, darling. After her mother left, Victoria stood alone in her office and tried to remember the last time she'd made a choice based on what she wanted rather than what was expected. The memory wouldn't come. Perhaps it had been too long. Perhaps she'd never learned how. She was still standing there, staring at her reflection in the glass, when everything changed. Mark's morning had proceeded with the reliable rhythm of routine. Drop Jamie at school by 7:30, arrive at Lane Enterprises by 8, change into his maintenance uniform in the basement locker room, collect his equipment cart, and begin his rounds on the executive floors. Most people didn't notice the maintenance staff. They were ghosts moving through the corporate landscape, invisible hands that kept the machine running smoothly. Mark had learned to appreciate the invisibility. It meant no uncomfortable questions about why a man with a master's degree in structural engineering was emptying trash cans and fixing leaky faucets. The answer was simple, even if it was nobody's business: flexible hours, health insurance, stability. Jamie needed all three, and Mark's pride was a small price to pay. He was replacing paper towels in the executive washroom when he heard raised voices from down the hall. Not unusual. Executives shouted into phones all the time, made dramatic pronouncements, conducted negotiations at volumes that suggested they'd forgotten other people existed. Mark kept working, invisible as always, until the voices grew closer and he recognized them as belonging to two of the board members he'd seen occasionally in passing. She's being stubborn about it, that's all. The first voice was nasally, irritated. Constance says she'll come around. She'd better. The Blackwell merger is too important to let her personal hang-ups derail it. The second voice was deeper, more aggressive. If she can't close this deal, maybe it's time to consider other options for leadership. Mark's hands stilled. He shouldn't be listening to this. Whatever corporate drama was unfolding, it had nothing to do with him. He finished restocking the towels quickly and moved to his cart, intending to disappear before the board members rounded the corner. Except his cart had a stuck wheel, the left one that had been giving him trouble all week, and when he tried to maneuver it, the entire thing lurched sideways, sending cleaning supplies clattering across the marble floor. Jesus Christ, one of the board members snapped. Watch where you're going. Mark looked up into the floored face of Harrison Steele, board chairman, and from what Mark had gathered through careful observation, Victoria Lane's primary antagonist. Beside him stood Gerald Morris, another board member whose expression suggested he found Mark's existence personally offensive. My apologies, sir. Mark kept his voice neutral, his eyes down, as he began gathering the scattered supplies. The wheel's been sticking. I'll have it replaced today. See that you do. Steele stepped around him like Mark was part of the furniture. Efficiency, Morris. That's what we need more of around here. Efficiency and decisive leadership. They continued down the hall, their voices fading, leaving Mark alone with his mess and the uncomfortable feeling that he'd witnessed something he shouldn't have. He finished collecting his supplies quickly, testing the cart's wheel with a frown. It would hold for now, but he'd need to requisition a new one from facilities. He was pushing the cart toward the elevator bank when he noticed a door slightly ajar. Victoria Lane's office. Mark had been in there a dozen times to empty trash, fix her window blinds, replace burnt-out bulbs. Each time she'd been on the phone or in a meeting, barely glancing at him, the invisibility he'd perfected. But now the office was empty, and through the gap in the door he could see Victoria standing at the window, her shoulders rigid, her reflection in the glass showing an expression of such profound weariness that Mark felt something twist in his chest. He should leave. He should move on to the next floor, maintain his invisibility, keep his head down and his life simple. Instead, he knocked softly on the doorframe. Victoria turned, and for just a second her professional mask slipped. Mark saw confusion, then recognition, then the swift reassembly of composure that powerful people learn to deploy like armor. "Yes?" Her voice was polite, distant. "I'm sorry to disturb you, Ms. Lane." Mark kept his tone respectful, professional. "I noticed the temperature sensor in your office was registering incorrectly yesterday. I wanted to check if you'd been experiencing any climate control issues." It was complete fiction. The temperature sensor was fine, but it got him through the door. Victoria blinked, clearly thrown by the specific nature of the question. Yes, actually. It's been rather cold in here the past few afternoons. I'll take a look at it now, if that's convenient." "Of course." She moved aside, her attention already drifting back to her computer screen. Mark wheeled his cart inside and went to the wall panel that controlled the office climate. He made a show of checking the settings, adjusting non-existent parameters, all while acutely aware of Victoria's presence behind him. Up close, she was both exactly what he expected and nothing like it. Tall, elegant, moving through space with the kind of unconscious grace that came from a lifetime of knowing you belonged exactly where you were. "You're Mark, aren't you?" The question surprised him enough that he nearly dropped his screwdriver. "Mark. Holden?" He turned to find her watching him with unexpected focus. "Yes, ma'am." "You've been working this floor for about 6 months." It wasn't a question. "You're always very thorough. I appreciate that." Mark felt heat climb his neck. "Thank you. I just try to do my job well." "That's becoming increasingly rare." Victoria's smile was brief, tired. "Most people do just enough to get by." There was something in her voice, a weariness that matched what he'd seen in her reflection, that made Mark bolder than he should have been. "Respectfully, Ms. Lane, I think most people are doing their best with what they have. Sometimes that looks like getting by because that's all the energy they've got left." The words hung in the air between them. Mark immediately wanted to take them back, to apologize for overstepping, for forgetting his place. But Victoria was looking at him now with genuine curiosity, her head tilted slightly. "That's a remarkably philosophical perspective from—" She trailed off, and Mark watched her catch herself. "I'm sorry, that was condescending." "It's fine." Mark turned back to the temperature panel, uncomfortable with the sudden intimacy of the conversation. "You're not wrong. I am maintenance staff. People don't usually expect us to have opinions about human nature." "Do you have opinions about human nature?" Mark adjusted a setting that didn't need adjusting. "I think people are mostly trying to survive with dignity and tact. Everything else is just details." "Survival with dignity." Victoria repeated the phrase like she was testing its weight. "Is that what you're doing?" The question was too personal, too close to truths Mark didn't share with anyone. He straightened, closing the temperature panel with a decisive click. "I'm making sure your office stays comfortable, ma'am. That's what I'm doing." He expected her to dismiss him then, to return to whatever CEO crisis had put that exhausted look on her face. Instead, she studied him with an intensity that made him want to flee and stay in equal measure. "Your tie is crooked," she said finally. Mark glanced down. His tie, the only one he owned that was nice enough for even his invisible work, was indeed twisted, the knot sitting askew. He dressed in a hurry that morning after Jamie spilled orange juice on his first shirt choice. "I'll fix it," he said, reaching for the knot. "Let me." Victoria stepped forward before Mark could process what was happening, her hands already moving to his collar. Later, Mark would try to explain what happened in that moment. How Victoria Lane's fingers, cool, efficient, smelling faintly of expensive lotion, brushed against the hollow of his throat. How every nerve in his body suddenly focused on that small point of contact. How his breath caught so hard it was almost a gasp, his body freezing like a rabbit caught in headlights. How he forgot, for one terrible second, to be invisible. Victoria's hands stilled. Her eyes lifted to his face, surprise flickering across her features. They were standing close enough that Mark could see the flecks of amber in her brown eyes, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her breath. Time did something strange, stretched and compressed simultaneously. Mark was acutely aware of everything. The citrus scent of her perfume, the soft sound of traffic 40 floors below, the way her pupils dilated slightly as she looked at him. His heart hammered against his ribs hard enough that he was certain she could feel it through his shirt. Mark's voice came out rough. He cleared his throat, took a step back, his hands rising instinctively to finish adjusting his tie himself. "Thank you. I have other floors to cover." He was already moving toward his cart, desperate to escape, when Victoria spoke again. "Wait." Mark stopped but didn't turn around. His hands gripped the cart handle hard enough to hurt. "I'm sorry," Victoria said quietly. "That was inappropriate. I shouldn't have. It's fine." Mark forced himself to turn, to meet her eyes, to project a calm he absolutely did not feel. Just a crooked tie, no harm done. But they both knew that wasn't true. Something had shifted in the air between them, something that couldn't be unnamed now that it had been acknowledged. Victoria's professional composure had cracked just enough to show the woman underneath, uncertain, surprised, perhaps as unsettled as Mark felt. "Have a good day, Ms. Lane." Mark pushed his cart toward the door, needing to end this before he did something monumentally stupid like try to explain why her touch had felt like lightning. "Mark?" He paused in the doorway. "Thank you for the temperature fix and the philosophical perspective." Mark nodded once and escaped into the hallway, his heart still racing, his skin still tingling where her fingers had brushed his throat. He made it to the elevator bank before he had to stop, leaning against the wall and taking several deep breaths. Stupid. That was stupid. Victoria Lane was a CEO worth probably more money than Mark would see in 10 lifetimes. She was elegant, educated, powerful. He was a janitor with the second-hand tie and a son to support. Whatever had just happened in that office, that moment of connection, of unexpected electricity, it didn't matter. It couldn't matter. Mark had learned a long time ago that people like him didn't get fairy tale endings. They got steady paychecks and health insurance and the quiet dignity of showing up every day to do honest work. That was enough. That had to be enough. He pushed away from the wall and continued his rounds, determinedly invisible once more. Victoria stood in her office doorway and watched Mark Holden disappear into the elevator, her fingers still tingling from where they'd touched his collar. What the hell had just happened? She'd straightened ties before, quick, thoughtless gestures at charity galas when board members or donors showed up slightly disheveled. It had never felt like anything. But when her fingers had brushed Mark's throat and he'd stopped breathing, when she'd felt the rapid flutter of his pulse against her fingertips, something had cracked open inside her chest. Recognition. That's what it had felt like. The sudden, shocking recognition of another human being as more than furniture in the landscape of her carefully controlled life. "Vic?" Marcus appeared in the doorway, his expression concerned. "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm fine." Victoria shook herself, moving back to her desk. "Just processing the conversation with my mother." It was only partially a lie. She was processing, just not what Marcus assumed. "Want to talk about it?" Marcus settled into his usual chair, his eyes too knowing. "No." Victoria pulled up her email, scanning messages without really seeing them. "I want to work. I want to focus on the quarterly projections and the Malaysian expansion and literally anything that doesn't involve my personal life becoming a board agenda item. Healthy coping mechanisms. I love it. Despite herself, Victoria smiled. Go away, Marcus. Going. He stood but paused at the door. For what it's worth, you deserve better than Richard Blackwell and a marriage that's essentially a corporate merger. You deserve someone who makes you... Marcus. Fine, fine. He held up his hands in surrender. But I'm right, and you know it. After he left, Victoria sat alone in her office and tried to focus on work. The emails blurred together. Her mind kept circling back to that moment. Mark's sharp intake of breath, the vulnerability in his eyes before he'd shuttered it behind professionalism, the way he'd looked at her like she was real rather than a corporate icon. She found herself pulling up the employee database, searching for his file with an urgency that should have alarmed her. Mark Holden, age 34, hired 8 months ago. Previous employment, various maintenance and facilities positions across the city. Education, listed as high school, nothing beyond. Emergency contact, Jamie Holden, son. No spouse listed, no partner. Clean employment record. Consistently positive supervisor reviews praising his reliability and attention to detail. The file told her nothing and everything. It told her Mark was a single father, that he worked steadily if not spectacularly, that he was exactly what he appeared to be, an invisible man doing invisible work to support his family. It didn't tell her why his pulse had jumped under her fingers. It didn't tell her why she'd felt that spark of connection. It didn't tell her why she was sitting here, staring at his employee photo, bland, professional, revealing nothing, and wondering what his story really was. Victoria closed the file with a decisive click. This was ridiculous. She had actual problems to solve. Her mother's pressure, the board's demands, Richard Blackwell's pending marriage proposal. She didn't have time to moon over the maintenance worker whose tie she'd straightened. Except she couldn't quite shake the memory of his voice saying, I think people are mostly trying to survive with dignity and tact, or the way he'd looked at her like he understood exactly what that cost. Her phone buzzed. A text from her mother. Thursday, 7 p.m., Blackwell Club. Don't be late. Wear the blue dress Richard likes. Victoria stared at the message, feeling the familiar cage of expectation closing around her. This was her life. Choreographed dinners, strategic marriages, every choice made by committee. She'd accepted it years ago, had even convinced herself she preferred it this way. No messy emotions, no unpredictable feelings, just the clean lines of duty and dynasty. But for one moment, standing close enough to Mark Holden to feel his breath hitch, she'd remembered what it felt like to be surprised by something real. Victoria set down her phone and returned to work, pushing the memory away. Reality didn't care about moments. Reality demanded quarterly earnings and board votes and marriages that made strategic sense. She had 3 days to prepare for dinner with Richard Blackwell. 3 days to convince herself that partnership without passion was enough. She almost believed it. The week progressed with its usual relentless momentum. Victoria attended meetings, reviewed contracts, negotiated deals, and maintained the careful facade that everything was proceeding according to plan. She didn't think about Mark Holden. Or when she did, when she caught a glimpse of someone in maintenance blues in the hallway or found herself touching her own collar absently, she firmly redirected her thoughts to things that mattered. Thursday evening arrived with the inevitability of a doctor's appointment you'd been dreading. Victoria dressed in her apartment, the blue dress her mother had specified, pearls, heels that made her 3 inches taller and somehow less real. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw exactly what she was supposed to be. Elegant, composed, appropriate. Empty. The Blackwell Club occupied the top floor of one of the city's oldest buildings, all dark wood and leather, and the kind of money that didn't need to announce itself. Richard was waiting at their usual table, his smile perfectly calibrated as he stood to greet her. Victoria, you look stunning. He kissed her cheek, his cologne expensive and impersonal. Richard? She settled into her seat, accepting the wine the sommelier poured without looking at it. How was Hong Kong? Productive. Richard launched into details about his latest acquisition, his voice carrying the enthusiasm of someone discussing a particularly satisfying golf game. Victoria listened with practiced attention, making appropriate sounds of interest, her mind cataloging everything she should be feeling: attraction, engagement, excitement about building something together. She felt none of it. She felt like she was watching herself from outside her body, playing the role of Victoria Lane, CEO and future strategic spouse. Which is why I wanted to talk to you tonight, Richard was saying. Victoria refocused, catching the shift in his tone. I know we've been dancing around this for months, but I think it's time we made things official. He reached into his jacket pocket, and Victoria's stomach dropped. Not here. Not now. Not like this. Choreographed in public and exactly what everyone expected. Richard, she started, I know you value directness, so I'll be direct. He pulled out a small velvet box, but didn't open it yet. This makes sense, Victoria. Our companies complement each other. Our families have been friendly for decades. We understand each other's worlds, each other's expectations. I can give you partnership, stability, the kind of alliance that will make both our boards happy. Is that what you're offering? Victoria's voice was steadier than she felt. An alliance? I'm offering a future. Richard's expression was earnest, and Victoria thought he probably believed what he was saying. Look, I know this isn't some fairy tale romance. We're both too practical for that. But I respect you, Victoria. I admire what you've built, and I think we could build something even bigger together. He opened the box. The ring was exactly what Victoria would have expected. Tasteful, expensive, appropriate. She looked at it and felt absolutely nothing. Richard, She paused, searching for words that wouldn't completely shatter the careful diplomatic relationship between their families. I appreciate the offer, truly, but I need time to think about this. Something flickered across Richard's face. Surprise, perhaps even hurt. I thought we were on the same page about this. Your mother said, My mother doesn't make my decisions. The words came out sharper than Victoria intended. She softened her tone. I'm sorry. It's a lot, and I need to be sure I'm making the right choice for the right reasons. Richard studied her for a long moment, then slowly closed the ring box. You're having doubts. I'm having thoughts, Victoria corrected, about what I want my life to look like, about whether strategic partnerships are enough when… She stopped herself. When what? When you've felt someone's pulse jump under your fingertips, when you've remembered what surprise feels like, when you've glimpsed the possibility that maybe there's more to life than quarterly earnings and board votes. When there are so many other factors to consider, Victoria finished weakly. Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. You know what I think? I think someone has been putting romantic notions in your head. Some friend telling you that you deserve passion and fireworks and all that nonsense people sell in movies. His voice wasn't unkind, just matter of fact. We're not those people, Victoria. We're not built for grand passion. We're built for legacy, for empire building, and the sooner you accept that, the happier you'll be. Maybe he was right. Maybe Victoria was being foolish, letting one strange moment with a man she barely knew make her question a life path that made perfect sense. Maybe growing up meant accepting that adult love was different from fairy tales, quieter, more practical, built on respect rather than fireworks. I'll think about everything you've said, Victoria promised. And I'll give you an answer soon. That's fair, isn't it? Richard nodded slowly. Fair enough. But Victoria, don't take too long. The board on both sides is getting impatient, and I'd hate for external pressure to force a decision you haven't made for yourself. The implied threat was delicate but clear. Victoria felt it settle over her shoulders like a familiar weight. This was how her world worked. Every decision tangled up in shareholder value and corporate strategy. Every choice carrying consequences that rippled far beyond her personal preferences. They finished dinner with careful conversation about neutral topics, and Richard drove her home with perfect courtesy. When he kissed her goodnight at her door, Victoria felt nothing beyond mild appreciation for his restraint. Inside her apartment, she finally let herself breathe. She kicked off the uncomfortable heels, poured herself a glass of wine she wouldn't drink, and stood at her window looking out at the Chicago skyline. Somewhere in this city, Mark Holden was probably putting his son to bed, reading bedtime stories, living a quiet life that had nothing to do with corporate mergers or strategic marriages. And for one weak moment, Victoria let herself wonder what that would feel like, to make choices based on what felt right rather than what made strategic sense. Her phone buzzed. A text from her mother. Richard called, I'm so proud of you, darling. The announcement will be perfect for the spring shareholders meeting. Victoria stared at the message. She hadn't said yes. She'd explicitly asked for time to think. But in her mother's world, in the board's world, her hesitation was just a formality. The decision had already been made by everyone except her. She thought about Mark's words. People are mostly trying to survive with dignity intact. Was there dignity in accepting what everyone expected? Or was dignity actually about having the courage to want something more? Victoria didn't have an answer. But standing in her expensive apartment, wearing a dress someone else had chosen, contemplating a marriage that made perfect sense to everyone but her, she felt something crack open inside her chest. It felt dangerously like hope. And that scared her more than anything else. The hope lasted exactly until Friday morning, when Victoria arrived at her office to find Harrison Steele and two other board members waiting outside her door like vultures circling prey. "Gentlemen," Victoria kept her voice level as she unlocked her office, though her instincts were already screaming danger. "This is unexpected. I don't believe we had a meeting scheduled." "We don't need a meeting for a friendly conversation." Steele's smile didn't reach his eyes as he followed her inside, the other board members flanking him like enforcers. "We heard about your dinner with Richard last night. We wanted to offer our congratulations." Victoria set her briefcase down with deliberate care, buying herself time to think. "I appreciate your enthusiasm, but there's nothing to congratulate yet. Richard and I are still discussing the possibility." "The possibility?" Gerald Morris repeated the word like it tasted sour. "Victoria, with all due respect, this isn't a possibility we're discussing. This is a strategic necessity. The Blackwell merger represents the single biggest growth opportunity this company has seen in a decade." "I'm aware of the business case." Victoria moved behind her desk, claiming the power position. "I'm also aware that my personal life shouldn't be decided by committee." "Your personal life became committee business the moment you took over as CEO." Steele settled into a chair without being invited, his posture radiating entitled authority. "You know how this works, Victoria. You've always known. Leadership at this level requires sacrifice. Your grandfather understood that. Your father understood that. The question is, do you?" The implication hung in the air like poison gas. Victoria felt her jaw tighten, felt the familiar anger that came from being treated like a chess piece rather than a person. But she'd learned young that showing emotion to men like Steele was blood in the water. "I understand my responsibilities perfectly," she said coldly. "What I don't understand is why my acceptance of a marriage proposal is more important to this board than my track record of growing this company's value by 40% in 3 years. Because shareholders don't just invest in numbers." The third board member, Thomas Wright, old money and older values, leaned forward. "They invest in stability, in family values, in the kind of traditional leadership that makes them comfortable. A young, unmarried female CEO makes people nervous. A young CEO in a strong marriage to an equally powerful family? That's a narrative people can get behind." "So this is about narrative." Victoria's voice could have cut glass. "About making shareholders comfortable with the idea of a woman in charge. This is about reality." Steele's patience was clearly wearing thin. "You want to lead this company? Then lead it. Make the hard choices. Stop acting like a romantic teenager and start thinking like the executive you claim to be." Victoria's hands clenched under her desk, her nails digging into her palms hard enough to hurt. She wanted to throw them out, to tell them exactly where they could shove their strategic marriage and their comfortable narratives. But the part of her that had been raised for this role, the part that understood power and how to wield it, knew that open defiance would only strengthen their position. "I'll give Richard an answer within the week," she said finally. "That's all I'm prepared to commit to right now." Steele exchanged glances with the other board members, some silent communication passing between them. "See that you do." "The spring shareholders meeting is in 4 months. We'd like to make the announcement then. Engagement, wedding date, merger timeline, all rolled into one happy package." He stood, and the others followed suit. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Victoria, for everyone's sake." After they left, Victoria sat alone in her office and tried to control the shaking in her hands. Rage, that's what this was. Pure, undiluted rage at being reduced to a bargaining chip, at having her entire life mapped out by men who saw her as a means to an end rather than an actual human being with wants and needs of her own. Her phone buzzed. Marcus, of course. I saw the vultures leave. You okay? Victoria typed back, "Office, now." Marcus appeared 90 seconds later, took one look at her face, and quietly closed the door behind him. That bad? They're giving me a week to accept Richard's proposal. After that, I'm guessing they'll start making noises about leadership changes. Victoria's voice was flat, emotionless. She'd learned that was the only way to discuss things that made her want to scream. Apparently, my value as CEO is contingent on my willingness to perform in their Victorian marriage plot. That's illegal as hell. Marcus's voice was sharp with anger. We could fight this, Vic. Hostile board action, gender discrimination, and destroy the company in the process? Turn Lane Enterprises into a cautionary tale about family drama? Victoria shook her head. They know I won't do that. They're counting on it. Marcus dropped into a chair, his usual easy confidence replaced by frustrated helplessness. So what? You just marry Richard Blackwell and spend the rest of your life as a corporate trophy wife? That's your plan? I don't have a plan. The admission felt like defeat. I just have obligations and limited choices and a growing suspicion that I made a terrible mistake thinking I could do this job without sacrificing everything that makes life worth living. You made no mistake. Marcus's voice was fierce. You've been brilliant, and they know it. That's why they're so desperate to control you, because you're too good at this, and it threatens their little boys' club. Victoria wanted to believe him. She wanted to feel the righteous anger that would let her fight back. Instead, she just felt tired. Tired of battles, tired of proving herself, tired of the constant calculation that went into every decision. I need some air, she said abruptly. I need to think. Want company? No, thank you, but no. Victoria grabbed her phone and headed for the door. I just need to walk for a while. She took the elevator down to the 35th floor, far enough from the executive suite to breathe, close enough to maintain the illusion of control, and started walking the hallways with no particular destination in mind. The 35th floor housed mostly mid-level management, people busy enough with their own work to not notice a CEO having a minor crisis. Victoria turned a corner and nearly collided with a maintenance cart. Sorry, Mark Holden looked up, and whatever he'd been about to say died on his lips. Ms. Lane. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Mark's expression cycled through surprise, concern, and something else Victoria couldn't quite name. She realized she must look as wrecked as she felt, probably why she'd been avoiding mirrors all morning. Mark. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. I didn't realize you worked this floor. I'm covering for someone on vacation. Mark's eyes searched her face with an intensity that should have felt invasive, but instead felt oddly grounding. Are you okay? The question was so simple, so genuinely concerned, that Victoria felt something crack open in her chest. When was the last time someone had asked her that and actually wanted to know the answer? I'm fine, she said automatically. Mark didn't look convinced. With respect, Ms. Lane, you look like you're about 30 seconds from either crying or punching something. Despite everything, Victoria felt a startled laugh escape. Is that your professional maintenance opinion? It's my human being who recognizes another human being having a bad day opinion. Mark glanced around the empty hallway, then back at her. There's a storage room around the corner. It's quiet, and it has a decent chair. If you need 5 minutes away from whatever's happening. Victoria knew she should decline. She should return to her office, compose herself, handle this crisis the way she'd been trained to handle every crisis, with strategic planning and emotional distance. But something about Mark's steady presence, the genuine concern in his eyes, made her want to accept the offered sanctuary. Lead the way, she said quietly. The storage room was exactly what Mark had promised. Small, windowless, but surprisingly clean and organized. Mark pulled out a folding chair and gestured for Victoria to sit, then positioned himself near the door with his arms crossed, giving her space while somehow still offering support. Victoria sat down and pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to hold back the wave of emotion threatening to overwhelm her. This is ridiculous. I'm sitting in a storage room having a breakdown while my maintenance worker stands guard. This is not how CEOs are supposed to handle stress. Maybe CEOs are supposed to be human sometimes too, Mark suggested gently. Not according to my board. The words slipped out before Victoria could stop them. According to them, I'm supposed to be a perfectly controlled corporate asset who makes strategic decisions without messy things like feelings getting in the way. Sounds lonely. Victoria's hands dropped from her face. She looked at Mark, really looked at him, and saw understanding in his eyes that had nothing to do with corporate experience and everything to do with simply recognizing pain. It is, she admitted. It's incredibly lonely. Mark nodded slowly, and for a moment they just existed in the quiet of the storage room, two people from completely different worlds who'd somehow stumbled into honesty with each other. Can I tell you something? Mark's voice was careful, like he was testing whether the moment could hold more truth. That first day when you straightened my tie, I went home that night and couldn't stop thinking about it. Not in a... it wasn't... He struggled for words, his cheeks coloring slightly. I just couldn't remember the last time someone had touched me like that. Like I was real. Like I mattered. Victoria's breath caught. She knew exactly what he meant. That moment when his pulse had jumped under her fingers, when she'd seen him as a person rather than part of the corporate furniture. I couldn't stop thinking about it either, she confessed. The admission hung in the air between them, weighted with implications neither of them seemed ready to examine. Mark shifted slightly, his expression conflicted. Ms. Lane, Victoria. The correction was instinctive. Please. In here, just Victoria. Victoria, Mark repeated, like he was testing the feel of her name. I don't know what you're going through right now, and I know I'm probably the last person who should be giving advice to someone like you, but for what it's worth, the fact that you're in here having feelings about it instead of just doing whatever they want, that's not weakness. That's the opposite of weakness. Tell that to my board. Your board doesn't matter. Mark's voice was firm. Not in the way you think they do. What matters is whether you can look at yourself in the mirror and recognize the person looking back. Because if you can't, no amount of shareholder value is going to fix that. Victoria felt tears prick her eyes. Stupid, unprofessional tears she had no business shedding in front of an employee. But something about Mark's words had hit exactly the fear she'd been avoiding, that in becoming the CEO everyone wanted, she'd lost the person she actually was. I'm supposed to get engaged, she said abruptly, to a man I don't love for reasons that make perfect business sense. And everyone in my life, my mother, the board, probably half the shareholders, thinks I'm being childish for hesitating. Mark was quiet for a moment. What do you think? I think I'm terrified. The admission came out in a whisper. I think I'm terrified that if I say yes, I'll wake up in 20 years and realize I traded my life for a company. But I'm equally terrified that if I say no, I'll lose everything I've worked for, and it won't matter anyway because I'll just be alone. You won't be alone. Mark's voice was gentle, but certain. You'll have yourself. And that's not nothing, Victoria. That's actually everything. Before Victoria could respond, before she could examine why his words felt like both comfort and devastation, her phone buzzed insistently. She glanced at it. Her assistant, multiple urgent messages about a conference call she was apparently late for. I have to go. She stood quickly, wiping at her eyes. Thank you for the chair and the perspective. Anytime. Mark moved aside to let her pass, and for just a second their hands brushed. Another moment of unexpected contact that sent electricity up Victoria's arm. She paused in the doorway. Mark? What you said about mattering? You do. Matter, I mean, just for the record. Then she was gone, hurrying back toward the elevator before she could see his expression, before she could acknowledge the warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with business strategy and everything to do with the way Mark Holden had looked at her like she was worth more than her quarterly earnings. The weekend passed in a blur of obligatory social events and carefully worded emails from board members checking on her decision timeline. Victoria attended a charity gala where Richard was charming and appropriate, fielded 3 calls from her mother about wedding venues, and spent Sunday night staring at her ceiling wondering when her life had become a negotiation she was losing. Monday morning, she arrived at the office to find a message from her assistant. Mr. Holden from facilities called. Says he needs to check your office climate control system. Should I schedule him? Victoria's finger hovered over the keyboard. She should say no. She should maintain professional distance and stop seeking out moments with a man who represented everything she couldn't have. Simplicity, honesty, choice. She typed, "Yes, this afternoon if possible." Mark showed up at 2 o'clock with his cart and his careful professionalism, though his eyes met hers with an awareness that hadn't been there before the storage room confession. "Ms. Lane, your assistant said you were having climate issues again. The temperature's been fluctuating." It was complete fiction, and they both knew it. Mark moved to the wall panel, and they fell into an odd dance, him making unnecessary adjustments while Victoria pretended to work, both of them acutely aware of the other's presence in ways that had nothing to do with HVAC systems. "How are you doing?" Mark asked finally, his voice low enough that anyone passing in the hallway wouldn't hear. "Since Friday?" "I'm managing." Victoria kept her eyes on her computer screen. "The board's still pressuring me. My mother's picking out china patterns. Richard's being patient but pointed, and I'm still no closer to knowing what I actually want." "What would you choose if there were no consequences?" The question was simple, devastating. Victoria's hand stilled on her keyboard. "I don't know. I've spent so long thinking about what I should choose that I've forgotten how to think about what I want to choose." Mark was quiet for a moment. Then, "When my wife died, I spent about 6 months just going through the motions, taking care of Jamie, going to work, doing all the things I was supposed to do. And one day, Jamie asked me if I was sad, and I realized I'd stopped letting myself feel anything because feeling meant acknowledging how broken I was." Victoria turned to look at him, her throat tight. "What changed?" "I decided that feeling broken was better than feeling nothing." Mark met her eyes. That living with the pain was better than becoming someone who couldn't feel pain anymore. Because the price of not feeling the hard stuff is that you stop feeling the good stuff too. "Is there good stuff?" Victoria's voice was barely a whisper. "In your life now?" "Yeah." Mark's smile was small but genuine. "Every morning when Jamie tells me about his dreams. Every time I fix something and it actually stays fixed. Small things, mostly. But they're mine, and they're real. And nobody gets to tell me they're not enough." Victoria felt something shift inside her chest. A recognition of the life Mark was describing, so different from hers but somehow touching something she'd buried deep. "I envy that. The certainty of knowing what matters." "You know what matters." Mark's voice was gentle. "You're just scared to admit it because admitting it means making a choice that's going to disappoint people." Before Victoria could respond, her office door opened without warning. Marcus stuck his head in, saw Mark at the climate panel, and his expression shifted into something protective and concerned. "Vic, sorry to interrupt, but we've got a situation." His eyes flicked to Mark, then back to Victoria with meaning. "Give me 5 minutes." Victoria's voice was all business now, the CEO mask sliding back into place. Marcus nodded and disappeared. Mark gathered his tools quickly, professionally, the moment of connection dissolving into appropriate workplace distance. "I should go," he said. "Mark." Victoria stopped him as he reached the door. "Thank you. For the maintenance work and the other thing." He nodded once, understanding everything she wasn't saying, and left. Victoria took a deep breath and went to find Marcus, who was pacing in his office with the kind of barely controlled agitation that meant serious trouble. "What situation?" she demanded. Marcus pulled up his phone and showed her the screen. It was a photo, slightly blurry, clearly taken from a distance, but unmistakably showing Victoria and Mark in the storage room on Friday. The angle made it look intimate, like they were having a private moment, which Victoria supposed they were. Except now it was splashed across an industry gossip blog with the headline, "Lane Enterprises CEO's Secret Romance, Victoria Lane Caught in Intimate Moment with Mystery Man." Victoria's stomach dropped. "Oh no." "Oh yes." Marcus's voice was grim. "It's already making the rounds on social media. Your mother's called 4 times. The board's requested an emergency meeting, and Richard..." He paused. "Richard's PR team is spinning it as a minor indiscretion before your engagement, which is apparently happening whether you've agreed or not." Victoria sank into a chair, her mind racing through implications and damage control scenarios. "Who took that photo?" "Unknown. Could be anyone. Disgruntled employee, opportunistic intern, corporate spy from a competitor. Does it matter? Marcus sat across from her. Vic, this is bad. The board's already looking for reasons to pressure you, and now you've handed them evidence of what? An affair? Poor judgment? Inappropriate workplace behavior? It wasn't an affair. Victoria's voice was sharp. It was a conversation with an employee who showed me basic human kindness when I was having a breakdown. I know that. You know that. But that's not what this photo says. Marcus leaned forward. The board's going to use this. They're going to say you're emotionally unstable, making poor choices, letting personal feelings interfere with professional judgment. And unless you have a really good counter strategy, they're going to leverage this into forcing the Blackwell engagement. Victoria closed her eyes, feeling the trap close around her. She'd been so careful for so long, every decision calculated, every interaction measured, and one moment of genuine human connection was about to cost her everything. What if I gave them what they want? The words came out before she'd fully thought them through. What if I got engaged to Richard, did the big announcement, made this all go away? Is that what you want? Marcus's voice was careful, neutral. No. The admission felt like stepping off a cliff. But I'm running out of options, Marcus, and I can't drag Mark into this. He's got a kid, a quiet life. He doesn't deserve to be collateral damage in my corporate war. Marcus studied her for a long moment, and Victoria saw understanding dawn in his eyes. You care about him, the maintenance guy. You actually care about him. Don't. Victoria's voice was sharp. Don't make this more than it is. I'm not making it anything. I'm just noticing that you're more worried about protecting him than protecting yourself. Marcus's expression softened. Vic, that's not nothing. Before Victoria could respond, her phone rang. Her mother, of course. Victoria answered on the third ring, bracing herself. Victoria Elizabeth Lane. Her mother's voice was ice wrapped in velvet. Please tell me you have a reasonable explanation for the photo currently circulating through every major business network in Chicago. It's not what it looks like, Mother. What it looks like is that my daughter, the CEO of a major corporation, was caught having an intimate moment with a maintenance worker days before what should have been her engagement announcement. Constance's voice sharpened. Do you understand how this makes you look? How this makes our family look? It was a conversation, that's all. Then you won't mind coming to dinner tonight to explain that to your father and Richard. 7 o'clock. Don't be late. The line went dead. Victoria set down her phone and met Marcus's sympathetic gaze. So that's happening. You could not go. And make everything worse? No. Victoria stood, squaring her shoulders. I'll go. I'll explain. I'll probably end up engaged by dessert because that's apparently how my life works now. Or, Marcus said carefully, you could tell them all to go to hell and make your own choice for once. And lose the company? Watch everything my grandfather built get torn apart by a hostile board? Victoria shook her head. I'm not that brave, Marcus. You're braver than you think. His voice was gentle. You just have to decide what you're actually fighting for. That afternoon, Victoria threw herself into work, trying to outrun the anxiety building in her chest. She had 3 hours until the dinner that would probably determine the rest of her life, and she was spending them reviewing quarterly projections like they mattered more than her happiness. At 4:30, there was a soft knock on her door. Victoria looked up to find Mark standing there, his expression troubled. I heard about the photo, he said without preamble. I wanted to apologize. I never meant to cause problems for you. You didn't cause anything. Victoria's voice was tired. I made a choice to talk to you. That's on me. Mark stepped inside, closing the door behind him. Are you okay? Really? The question, the same one he'd asked on Friday with the same genuine concern, nearly broke her. No, Victoria admitted. I'm not okay. I'm having dinner with my parents and Richard tonight, and I'm fairly certain I'm going to walk out of there engaged to be married because the alternative is watching my career implode. That's not the alternative. Mark's voice was firm. That's what they want you to think the alternative is. Mark, no, listen. He moved closer and Victoria found herself standing to meet him, drawn by something she couldn't name. I know I don't know anything about your world, I know I'm just the guy who fixes your climate control, but I know what it looks like when someone's about to give up on themselves. And Victoria, that's what you're doing. I'm being practical. You're being scared. Mark's eyes searched hers. And I get it. I do. But you told me that you couldn't remember the last time someone touched you like you were real. Well, you're real to me. And watching you agree to marry someone you don't love because a bunch of men in suits said you should? That's not real. That's giving up. Victoria felt tears threaten again. The second time in days that Mark had reduced her to this state. What do you want me to do? Walk away from everything? Start over. With what, Mark? I don't know how to be anyone except who I've been trained to be. Then maybe it's time to learn. Mark's voice was gentle now, coaxing. Look, I'm not saying you have to blow up your life. I'm just saying maybe there's a middle path you haven't considered yet. Like what? Mark was quiet for a moment, and Victoria watched something shift in his expression, a decision being made, a line being crossed. What if the board's biggest concern is appearances? The optics of you being single, the questions about your stability, the worry that you're too independent. That's exactly their concern. So what if you gave them a different narrative? Mark's words came slowly, carefully, like he was working out a puzzle in real time. What if instead of being the single CEO having inappropriate relationships with employees, you were the CEO in a stable, committed relationship? Victoria stared at him, not quite following. I don't have a stable, committed relationship. You could. Mark met her eyes steadily. With me. The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Victoria's brain stuttered, trying to process what he was suggesting. You're... what? Asking me out? I'm proposing a solution. Mark's voice was steady, though Victoria could see the tension in his jaw. The board wants you settled? Fine. You're in a relationship, with someone appropriate enough that it puts the concerns to rest, but not so high profile that it becomes about corporate mergers instead of about you. Mark, that's insane. Is it? He took a step closer. Think about it. The photo's already out there. Instead of it being evidence of an affair, it becomes evidence of a relationship. You tell your parents tonight that you've been seeing someone, that it's serious, that Richard's a lovely man, but you've already found what you're looking for. Victoria's mind was spinning. It was crazy. It was completely, utterly crazy. It was also, and this was the terrifying part, possibly brilliant. They'll never believe it. We're from completely different worlds. So? Your grandfather was a factory worker who built an empire. Self-made man, pulled himself up by his bootstraps. Isn't that the family mythology? Mark's expression was intense now, fully committed to the idea. What's more believable? That you fell for Richard Blackwell because the board told you to? Or that you fell for someone real, someone outside the corporate bubble, someone who reminds you of where your family came from? This is crazy, Victoria repeated, but her mind was already working through the angles. The board wanted stability, a committed relationship provided that. Her mother wanted grandchildren someday. Mark already had a son. Richard would be hurt, but he'd also be free to pursue someone who actually wanted him. And the shareholders. They'll eat it up, she said aloud, the realization hitting her. The press will eat it up. CEO finds love with regular guy, proves she hasn't lost touch with reality, modern romance across class lines. It's perfect. It could work, Mark agreed. They stood there staring at each other, the magnitude of what they were discussing settling between them. Victoria's practical mind was already mapping out logistics, timelines, the story they'd need to tell. But another part of her, the part that Mark kept reaching whether she wanted him to or not, was screaming that this was a terrible idea for reasons that had nothing to do with optics. Why would you do this? She asked finally. What's in it for you? Mark hesitated, and Victoria saw something flicker across his face. Vulnerability, maybe, or fear. Honestly? I don't know. Maybe because I've spent 3 years just surviving, and you made me remember what it feels like to actually want something. Or maybe because I know what it's like to be trapped by other people's expectations, and I hate watching it happen to you. He paused. Or maybe I'm just tired of being invisible. The last admission hit Victoria in the chest. She understood that feeling, the exhaustion of performing, of being seen only as what you could provide rather than who you actually were. "This would change everything," she said quietly. "Your life, Jamie's life, your privacy." "I know." Mark's voice was steady. "And I'm scared as hell, but I'm more scared of watching you give up and knowing I could have offered another option." Victoria's phone buzzed, her assistant, reminding her that she needed to leave in 30 minutes to make her dinner on time. The real world intruding on this moment of possibility. "I need to think about this," Victoria said, even though her mind was already made up, already racing ahead to how they could pull this off. "Think fast." Mark gave her a small smile. "Because if you're doing this, you need to walk into that dinner tonight with a story everyone believes." After he left, Victoria stood alone in her office and tried to catalog all the ways this could go catastrophically wrong. The lies they'd have to tell, the scrutiny they'd face, the very real possibility that they'd both end up worse off than they started. But against all of that, she weighed one simple fact. For the first time in years, she felt like she had a choice, a real choice, made by her, for reasons that had nothing to do with shareholder value. Victoria picked up her phone and called Marcus. "I need your help with something insane." "My favorite kind of something. Talk to me." And as she laid out the plan, the narrative they'd build, the timeline they'd establish, the way they'd turn a corporate crisis into a human interest story, Victoria felt something she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. She felt like herself again. Whether that was wisdom or disaster remained to be seen. Marcus listened to the entire plan without interrupting, which was how Victoria knew he thought she'd completely lost her mind. When she finally finished explaining, the silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that she checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "Say something," she demanded. "I'm trying to figure out if you're a genius or if you've had some kind of stress-induced psychotic break." Marcus's voice was careful, measured. "Vic, do you understand what you're proposing? You want to fake a relationship with your maintenance worker to get the board off your back about marrying Richard Blackwell. It's not fake if we're actually doing it." Even as Victoria said it, she recognized the thin logic. "And he's not just a maintenance worker. He's a single father with a master's degree who ended up in facilities because life gave him limited options. The story writes itself, Marcus. The story writes itself straight into a PR nightmare if anyone figures out this started as a strategic move instead of an actual relationship." Marcus's voice sharpened with concern. "And what happens when you have to end it? When the board's satisfied and you've bought yourself some time, and suddenly you have to explain why your great love affair fell apart?" Victoria hadn't thought that far ahead. She'd been too focused on the immediate problem, tonight's dinner, Richard's proposal, the trap closing around her life. "We'll figure that out when we get there." "That's not a plan. That's hope disguised as strategy." Marcus sighed, and Victoria could picture him rubbing his temples the way he did when she was being particularly stubborn. "Look, I get why you want to do this. I even understand the logic. But have you considered that maybe, just maybe, you're attracted to this guy and you're using corporate strategy as an excuse to act on it? That's not what this is. This, isn't it? Because from where I'm sitting, you've been different since that day he straightened his tie. You've been questioning everything, feeling things you usually keep locked down. And now suddenly you want to pretend to date him? Come on, Vic. Even you can't be that good at compartmentalizing." Victoria opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. Was Marcus right? Was she using the board's pressure as justification for something she wanted anyway? The thought was uncomfortable, complicated, and she didn't have time to examine it before her dinner. "Will you help me or not?" she asked finally. Marcus was quiet for another long moment. "Of course I'll help you. I always help you, even when I think you're making questionable life choices." "But Vic? Be careful. Not just with the board or the optics or the corporate fallout. Be careful with yourself. Because if this goes wrong, you're not just going to lose politically. You're going to lose something a lot more important." After she hung up, Victoria had exactly 20 minutes to transform herself from CEO, having a crisis, to woman about to announce a relationship that would change everything. She touched up her makeup, changed into something less severe than her usual business attire, and practiced her speech in the mirror until it sounded almost natural. The drive to her parents' house in Lake Forest took 40 minutes, and Victoria spent every second of it rehearsing variations of the same conversation. How much truth to mix with fiction? How to sell a relationship that was barely an idea, let alone a reality. How to make her parents believe she'd fallen for someone they'd never heard of. The Lane family estate sprawled across 5 acres of manicured lawn, all old money and older values wrapped in limestone and tradition. Victoria had grown up here, learned to be perfect here, absorbed the unspoken rules about duty and sacrifice that had shaped her entire life. She was about to break every single one of those rules. Her mother met her at the door, her expression a careful blend of disappointment and determination. "You're late." Traffic. Victoria kissed her mother's cheek, the familiar ritual feeling hollow. "Where's everyone else?" "Your father's in his study. Richard's in the living room looking wounded and noble," which I suppose is what happens when your almost fiancé gets caught in compromising photos. Constance's voice was sharp enough to cut. "I hope you have a good explanation prepared because Richard deserves one." Victoria followed her mother through the house, her heels clicking on marble floors that had witnessed generations of Lane family drama. The living room was exactly as she remembered, tasteful, expensive, designed to impress rather than comfort. Richard stood by the window in a pose that looked practiced, turning as she entered with an expression of hurt dignity. "Victoria," his voice was carefully neutral. "Richard, I'm sorry you had to see that photo. I can imagine how it looked. Can you?" For the first time since she'd known him, Richard's composure cracked slightly. "Because from where I'm standing, it looked like the woman I was about to propose to was having an intimate moment with another man days after asking me for more time to think." Victoria's father appeared in the doorway, his presence filling the room the way it always did. Thomas Lane had built empires through sheer force of will, and even at 70, he radiated the kind of power that made people instinctively straighten their spines. "Sit down, Victoria." It wasn't a request. "Let's hear this explanation." Victoria remained standing. She'd learned young that giving ground to her father was the first step toward losing the argument. "There's no explanation needed. The photo showed exactly what it was, me having a conversation with someone I care about." The silence that followed was profound. Constance's hand went to her throat, a gesture of shock that would have been funny if it wasn't so genuine. Richard's expression shifted from hurt to confusion. Her father's eyes narrowed with the sharp assessment of someone who'd built a career on reading people. "You care about him." Thomas's voice was flat, factual. "The maintenance worker." "His name is Mark Holden. He's a single father, a structural engineer who ended up in facilities work because life gave him limited options. And yes, I care about him." Victoria kept her voice steady, channeling every ounce of CEO authority into making this believable. "We've been seeing each other quietly for the past few months." "Months?" Constance's voice climbed an octave. "You've been seeing this man for months and never mentioned him? Would you have been receptive if I had?" Victoria met her mother's eyes. "You were already planning my wedding to Richard. You'd already decided what my life should look like. When exactly was I supposed to mention that I'd fallen for someone who didn't fit the approved narrative?" Richard moved closer, his expression hardening. "Is this why you kept putting me off? Why you needed more time, because you were already involved with someone else?" "I wasn't involved when you first proposed." That much was true, at least in the technical sense. "But yes, my feelings for Mark were part of why I hesitated. I couldn't commit to you when my heart was already engaged elsewhere." "Your heart?" Thomas's voice dripped with disdain. "Since when do Lane family CEOs make decisions based on hearts?" "Since I decided that becoming CEO didn't mean becoming inhuman." Victoria felt anger spike through her chest, hot and clarifying. "You want to know why I'm making this choice? Because I looked at a future with Richard and saw exactly what you and Mother have, a strategic partnership that looks good on paper and feels empty everywhere else." Constance gasped. "Victoria, that's completely unfair." "Is it?" Victoria turned to her mother. "When's the last time Dad told you he loved you? When's the last time you had a conversation that wasn't about the company or social obligations or maintaining appearances? When's the last time either of you chose each other instead of choosing what looked right?" The questions landed like grenades. Her parents exchanged glances, and Victoria saw something flicker between them. Recognition, perhaps, or old wounds being reopened. but her father's expression hardened quickly, walls slamming back into place. "What we have built together is stronger than romantic nonsense," Thomas said coldly. "We have partnership, respect, shared purpose. Those things last, Victoria. Passion burns itself out." "Maybe." Victoria felt suddenly exhausted, the weight of the performance crushing down on her shoulders. "But I'd rather burn out than never catch fire at all." Richard made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a scoff. "This is unbelievable. You're throwing away a partnership that could have transformed both our companies because of some maintenance worker who makes you feel alive?" He shook his head. "You're smarter than this, Victoria. Or I thought you were. I'm smart enough to know the difference between what I should want and what I actually want." Victoria met his eyes, and for a moment she felt genuinely sorry for him. "Richard, you deserve someone who loves you, not someone who chose you because the board said it was good business. Love." Richard practically spat the word. "You think you love this man? You barely know him. This is infatuation, Victoria. It's a rebellion against expectations, not a real relationship." "Then it's my rebellion to make." Victoria's voice was steel. "And my relationship to build or destroy as I see fit." Thomas moved towards his desk, pouring himself a scotch with deliberate movements that spoke of barely controlled anger. "Let me make sure I understand the situation. You're choosing to publicly align yourself with a man who works in facilities, who has a child from a previous relationship, who brings absolutely nothing to the table in terms of business connections or social standing. You're willing to damage your reputation, potentially alienate the board, and throw away an alliance with the Blackwell family, all because of feelings." "Yes." Victoria's voice didn't waver. "That's exactly what I'm doing." "Then you're a fool." Thomas drained his scotch in one swallow. "And I didn't raise a fool, which means you're lying to us. This is some kind of strategy, isn't it? A way to buy time, to dodge the Blackwell engagement while you figure out another angle." Victoria's stomach dropped. Her father had always been too perceptive, too good at reading the calculations behind people's choices. She forced herself to meet his eyes without flinching. "You think I'd lie about this? You think I'd invent a relationship just to avoid making a decision? I think you'd do anything to maintain control." Thomas set down his glass with a decisive click. "Here's what's going to happen. You'll end this ridiculous distraction with the maintenance worker. You'll apologize to Richard and accept his proposal. You'll do the spring announcement the board wants, and you'll stop this destructive pattern of putting personal whims above corporate responsibility." "Or what?" Victoria's voice was quiet, dangerous. "Or I'll call an emergency board meeting and recommend your removal as CEO." Thomas's expression was implacable. "I still have influence with enough board members to make that happen, Victoria. Don't test me." The threat hung in the air like a blade. Constance made a small sound of protest, but Thomas silenced her with a look. Richard watched the exchange with a mixture of fascination and vindication, clearly pleased to see Victoria finally being put in her place. Victoria felt her hands clench at her sides, felt rage and fear war in her chest. This was it. The moment where she either backed down or committed fully to the insanity she'd set in motion. Her father was giving her an out, a way to retreat with minimal damage. All she had to do was admit this was a mistake, accept Richard's proposal, fall back into line. All she had to do was give up the first real choice she'd made in years. "No." The word came out clear, final. Thomas's eyebrows rose. "Excuse me?" "I said no." Victoria straightened her shoulders, channeling every ounce of Lane family steel into her spine. "You want to call a board meeting? Go ahead. You want to try to remove me? Try. But I'm not ending my relationship with Mark. I'm not apologizing to Richard for having feelings for someone else, and I'm sure as hell not letting you threaten me into a marriage I don't want." "You're making a mistake." Thomas's voice was cold, distant, a catastrophic one. "Maybe." Victoria moved toward the door, done with this conversation, done with performing for people who saw her as a chess piece rather than a daughter. "But it's my mistake to make. And honestly, I'd rather make my own mistakes than live a perfect life that isn't actually mine." She was halfway to the door when her mother's voice stopped her. "Victoria, please, think about what you're doing. Think about the family." Victoria turned back to find her mother's carefully composed mask finally cracking, showing something that looked almost like genuine concern underneath. I am thinking about the family, Mother. I'm thinking about how grandfather built this company because he wanted to create something meaningful, not because he wanted to trap his descendants in golden cages. I'm thinking about how you and Dad have spent 40 years in a marriage that looks perfect from the outside and feels empty on the inside. And I'm thinking that maybe, just maybe, there's another way to live. There isn't. Constance's voice was soft, almost pitying. Not for people like us. We sacrifice for duty, Victoria. That's the price of the life we have. Then maybe I don't want this life. The admission came out before Victoria could stop it, raw and honest and terrifying. Maybe I want something smaller and messier and actually real. She left before anyone could respond, walking through the house she'd grown up in with the strange feeling that she was seeing it for the first time. The perfect furniture, the tasteful art, the expensive emptiness of a life built on appearances rather than substance. She'd always known this world was hollow, but she'd told herself the power and influence made up for it. Now she wasn't so sure. Victoria made it to her car before the shaking started. She sat in the driver's seat with her hands gripping the steering wheel and tried to process what she'd just done. She'd defied her father, rejected Richard, claimed a relationship that barely existed, and potentially set her career on fire. All for what? A maintenance worker who'd shown her kindness? A moment of connection that probably meant nothing? Her phone buzzed. Marcus. How did it go? Victoria typed back with trembling fingers. I think I just burned down my entire life. The response came immediately. Good. That one was getting cramped anyway. Come to my place. We need to strategy session this properly. 20 minutes later, Victoria was sitting in Marcus's minimalist downtown loft with a glass of wine she definitely shouldn't be drinking on an empty stomach, recounting the disaster that was dinner with her family. Your dad threatened to have you removed as CEO? Marcus's expression was grim. That's playing hardball, even for him. He won't actually do it. Victoria took a long drink of wine, hoping it was true. He built too much of his legacy on the idea of family leadership. Removing me would be admitting failure. Don't be so sure. Powerful men do strange things when their daughters stop taking orders. Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying her. So what now? You've committed to this relationship with Mark. You've rejected Richard publicly, and trust me, that story's going to leak. You've essentially declared war on your own family. What's the next move? Victoria set down her wine glass and pulled out her phone. The next move is making this relationship look real enough that the board has no choice but to accept it. She pulled up Mark's number. She'd had her assistant get it from HR, which was probably an ethical violation but seemed minor compared to everything else, and typed out a message before she could overthink it. Dinner at my parents' was a disaster. I told them about us. This is really happening. We need to talk about logistics. The response came back faster than she expected. Jamie's at a sleepover. I can come to you if you give me an address. Victoria sent him her location, then looked up to find Marcus watching her with an unreadable expression. What? You're really doing this. You're actually going all in on the maintenance worker romance. His name is Mark. Victoria felt defensive, protective in a way that surprised her. And yes, I'm really doing this. Unless you have a better idea for how to get the board off my back while maintaining some semblance of autonomy over my own life? Marcus held up his hands in surrender. No judgment. I'm just observing that for someone who claims this is purely strategic, you're getting pretty invested pretty quickly. Before Victoria could respond, before she could examine whether Marcus was right, her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered cautiously. Hello? Ms. Lane, this is Jennifer Kim from the Chicago Business Journal. The voice was professional, eager. I'm calling about the photo that's been circulating. I was hoping you might be willing to comment on your relationship with Mark Holden. Victoria's blood ran cold. How did you get this number? I'm a journalist, Ms. Lane. It's my job to find information. Kim's tone was friendly but determined. Look, I'm going to run a story either way. I'd prefer to have your side of it. Are you and Mr. Holden in a relationship? How long has this been going on? Does this mean the rumored engagement to Richard Blackwell is off? I have no comment at this time. Victoria's voice was icy. And if you call this number again, I'll have my legal team. Your father just called a board meeting for tomorrow morning. Emergency session to discuss leadership stability. I don't suppose you'd like to comment on that either?" Victoria hung up without responding, her heart hammering. She looked at Marcus, who'd clearly heard enough of the conversation to understand the implications. "He's really doing it," she said numbly. "My father's actually trying to remove me." "Maybe." Marcus's voice was careful. "Or maybe he's bluffing, trying to force your hand. Either way, you need to get ahead of this. You need to control the narrative before the board meeting tomorrow." "How? By going public with a relationship that's less than 6 hours old?" "By going public with a relationship that looks like it's been building for months." Marcus stood, his expression shifting into strategy mode. "Think about it, Vic. You've got until tomorrow morning to make this convincing, to turn what could be a scandal into a love story, to show the board that you're not having a breakdown, you're just human." A knock at the door interrupted them. Victoria's stomach flipped. Mark. She'd almost forgotten she'd invited him, caught up in the immediate crisis of her father's threat and the journalist's call. Marcus opened the door to reveal Mark Holden looking slightly overwhelmed and deeply out of place in his worn jeans and faded t-shirt. His eyes found Victoria immediately, concern flickering across his face. "You okay? Your text sounded—" He paused, taking in the wine, Marcus's strategic expression, Victoria's obvious stress. "What happened?" "Everything happened." Victoria gestured for him to come in. "My father's calling an emergency board meeting to discuss removing me as CEO. A journalist already knows your name and is writing a story about us. And we have approximately 12 hours to make a relationship that barely exists look real enough to survive corporate scrutiny." Mark absorbed this information with remarkable calm, then looked at Marcus. "You must be the CFO." "COO, actually, Marcus Chen." Marcus extended his hand and Mark shook it with the easy confidence of someone who didn't feel the need to prove anything. "I hear you're Victoria's secret boyfriend." "I hear I am too." Mark's smile was wry. "Though I'm still trying to figure out how we got here." "We got here because I panicked and you offered me an escape route." Victoria moved closer to Mark, studying his face for signs of regret or second thoughts. "But we're here now, and my father's forcing the issue. So if you want to back out, this is your chance. Walk away now and I'll handle the fallout. Stay, and your life is about to get very complicated very quickly." Mark was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes serious as he looked at her. Victoria found herself holding her breath, waiting for the inevitable moment when he'd realize this was insane and excuse himself from her corporate train wreck. "How complicated are we talking?" he asked finally. Marcus laughed despite himself. "You'd be dating one of Chicago's most high-profile CEOs in the middle of a corporate power struggle. The press will dig into every aspect of your life. Your son will be scrutinized. Your past will be examined. Your present will be photographed. And if the board decides Victoria's relationship with you proves she's unfit to lead, you'll be blamed for destroying a billion-dollar company." "So, pretty complicated." Mark's expression didn't change. He looked at Victoria. "What do you need from me?" The question was so simple, so direct, that Victoria felt something crack open in her chest. Not what could he gain, not what were the risks, just what did she need? "I need you to show up tomorrow at the board meeting. I need you to stand next to me and look like you belong there. I need you to help me sell a story that's going to determine whether I keep my job or lose everything my family built." "Okay?" Mark's voice was steady. "Then that's what I'll do." "Just like that?" Victoria couldn't keep the disbelief out of her voice. "You don't want to negotiate terms? Ask what you're getting out of this?" "What would I negotiate?" Mark's smile was small but genuine. "You're asking me to pretend to be in a relationship with a brilliant, beautiful woman who's fighting for her right to live her own life. That doesn't sound like a hardship, Victoria. That sounds like the easiest thing I've been asked to do in years." Victoria stared at him, completely thrown by the casual sincerity of his words. Brilliant, beautiful, fighting for her life. He made it sound heroic instead of desperate, like she was someone worth supporting rather than a corporate crisis waiting to explode. "Well," Marcus's voice broke the moment, "now that we've established Mark is either the most romantic man in Chicago or completely out of his mind, let's talk strategy. We need a story. We need a timeline. We need details that will hold up under scrutiny. And we need to figure out how to present this to the board in a way that makes you look stable instead of reckless. They spent the next 3 hours building a relationship out of fragments and fiction. Mark and Victoria had met 4 months ago when he'd been called to fix a problem with her office climate control. True, though not 4 months ago. They'd started talking, discovered unexpected connection, began meeting for coffee during Victoria's rare free moments. Plausible, if completely fabricated. The relationship had remained private because Victoria valued her privacy and wanted to be sure before going public. Convenient explanation that would satisfy most questions. "What about Jamie?" Victoria asked at one point. "Have you told him any of this?" Mark's expression flickered with something like guilt. "Not yet. I wanted to talk to you first, figure out what we're actually doing before I involve my son in corporate drama." "He's going to be involved whether you want him to be or not." Marcus's voice was practical. "The second this goes public, reporters are going to be looking into every aspect of your life, Mark. That includes Jamie, his school, his friends, his mother's death. Nothing's going to be off limits." Victoria saw Mark's jaw tighten, saw protective anger flash across his face. "Then we set boundaries. Jamie's off limits. He doesn't get photographed, doesn't get interviewed, doesn't become part of the story." "That's not how the press works," Marcus started. "Then that's how we make it work." Mark's voice was firm. "My son's been through enough. He lost his mother when he was 4 years old. I'm not letting him get caught in the crossfire of corporate politics because I agreed to help Victoria." Victoria felt something warm spread through her chest. Admiration, maybe, or recognition of the kind of fierce protectiveness she'd never experienced from her own parents. "We'll protect him," she promised. "Whatever it takes, we keep Jamie out of this." Mark nodded slowly, some of the tension easing from his shoulders. "Okay, then I'm in, completely." By the time they finished planning, it was past midnight. Marcus had left an hour earlier, muttering something about needing sleep before the apocalypse. Victoria walked Mark to the door, suddenly aware of how strange this all was. Planning a fake relationship in her friend's apartment with a man she barely knew, preparing to face down her father and the board with nothing but audacity and a good story. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for doing this, for not running away when you had the chance." Mark paused in the doorway, his expression thoughtful. "Can I ask you something? And I want an honest answer." "Okay." "Why me?" Mark's voice was genuinely curious. "You could have picked anyone for this. Someone from your social circle, someone with connections and status. Why did you say yes when I suggested this crazy plan?" Victoria thought about lying, about giving him some strategic reason that made sense on paper, but something about the late hour and the emotional exhaustion made her reckless with the truth. "Because when you straightened my tie and I felt your pulse jump under my fingers, I remembered what it felt like to be surprised by another human being. And I realized I'd spent so long being strategic that I'd forgotten how to be spontaneous." She met his eyes. "You made me remember. That's why." Mark was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then slowly, he stepped back into the apartment and closed the door behind him. "Victoria?" "Yes?" "Tomorrow, when we walk into that board meeting, I'm going to put my hand on your back. It's going to look like a possessive, supportive gesture, the kind of thing a boyfriend would do." His voice was low, careful. "But I need you to know right now, before we start performing for everyone else. I'm not doing this because it's strategic. I'm doing this because I want to. Because somewhere between fixing your temperature controls and listening to you talk about surviving with dignity, I started caring about what happens to you." Victoria's breath caught. "Mark, you don't have to say anything." Mark's smile was small, almost sad. "I just needed you to know that for me, at least, this stopped being entirely fake about 3 hours ago. Whatever we're building here, whatever story we're telling, I'm going to mean it, and you should be prepared for that." Then he was gone, leaving Victoria standing alone in Marcus's apartment with her heart hammering and her carefully constructed walls feeling dangerously close to crumbling. She'd set this whole thing in motion thinking she could control it, thinking she could use strategy to buy herself time and space. But somewhere in the planning and the plotting, something real had started to grow. and Victoria had no idea what to do about that. The board meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m., which gave Victoria approximately 7 hours to sleep, prepare, and transform herself into the kind of woman who could walk into corporate warfare with her maintenance worker boyfriend and emerge victorious. She didn't sleep. Instead, she went home to her apartment and spent the hours before dawn doing what she did best: researching, strategizing, preparing for every possible angle of attack. She pulled Mark's complete employment file, memorized the details of his education and work history, found the obituary for Sarah Holden that told the story of a young mother killed by a drunk driver. She learned about Jamie's school, his interests, the quiet life Mark had built in the aftermath of tragedy. And the more she learned, the more she understood that Mark Holden wasn't just convenient, he was real in a way that made everything about her current life feel hollow by comparison. By the time she left for the office, Victoria had a plan. Not a good plan necessarily, but a plan that at least gave them a fighting chance. She'd called the Chicago Business Journal back and agreed to an exclusive interview that afternoon, contingent on the board meeting going in her favor. She'd had Marcus Leek select details to key board members, enough to establish the relationship as serious without making it look planted. She'd even called her mother at 6 a.m. and left a voicemail that was equal parts apology and declaration of war. Mark met her in the lobby at 8:30, and Victoria's breath caught despite herself. He'd cleaned up, dress pants, button-down shirt, a tie that actually sat straight, but more than that, he carried himself differently. Not trying to be invisible anymore, but not trying to prove anything either. Just present, solid, real. "You ready for this?" Victoria asked as they rode the elevator up to the executive floor. No. Mark's honesty was refreshing, but I don't think anyone's actually ready to walk into their fake girlfriend's board meeting and help her fight for her career. I'm just planning to improvise. Despite everything, Victoria smiled. Good plan. The elevator doors opened onto chaos. Staff members were rushing between offices, phones were ringing constantly, and there was an energy in the air that spoke of crisis mode. Victoria had expected this. Her father's emergency board meeting would have set off alarm bells throughout the company. What she hadn't expected was to find Richard Blackwell standing in the hallway outside the boardroom, clearly waiting for her. "Victoria." His voice was cold, controlled. "I need a word before the meeting." Mark's hand immediately went to Victoria's back, the possessive, supportive gesture he'd warned her about, and she felt the solid warmth of his presence anchoring her. "Richard, this isn't a good time." "Make time." Richard's eyes flicked to Mark with barely concealed contempt. "Unless you'd prefer I share my thoughts with the entire board instead of giving you the courtesy of a private conversation." Victoria exchanged glances with Mark, who nodded slightly. "I'll be right inside," he said quietly, his hand squeezing her back once before he moved toward the boardroom. After he left, Richard stepped closer, his expression a mixture of hurt and fury. "I don't know what game you're playing, Victoria, but it ends today. You've embarrassed me, damaged a potential merger, and made a mockery of everything our families tried to build together." "Richard, I'm not finished." His voice was sharp as broken glass. "I was willing to overlook the photo, willing to believe you'd made a mistake. But then you stood in your parents' home and chose him over everything we could have had together. So now I'm going to walk into that boardroom and tell them exactly what I think of your judgment and your fitness to lead this company." Victoria felt ice slide down her spine. "You're going to vote to remove me. I'm going to vote to protect Lane Enterprises from a CEO who makes decisions based on hormones instead of business sense." Richard's smile was cruel. "Your father was right about you. You're not ready for this level of leadership, and by this afternoon the entire board is going to know it." He walked away before Victoria could respond, leaving her standing alone in the hallway with the crushing realization that this was worse than she'd thought. Her father wasn't just threatening to remove her, he'd built a coalition, and Richard Blackwell, with his wounded pride and damaged ego, was going to help him do it. Victoria took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and walked into the boardroom ready to fight for everything she'd built, or lose it all trying. The boardroom fell silent as Victoria entered, Mark a steady presence at her side. 12 board members sat around the massive mahogany table, their expressions ranging from concern to hostile. Her father occupied his usual position at the head of the table, his face carved from granite. Richard had already taken his seat, his posture radiating wounded dignity. Marcus caught her eye from his position near the window, his slight nod the only encouragement she was going to get. Harrison Steele cleared his throat, the sound like a judge's gavel. Ms. Lane, thank you for joining us. And Mr. Holden, I presume. Mark Holden, yes. Mark's voice was calm, steady, as he pulled out Victoria's chair before taking the empty seat beside her. The gesture was so naturally protective that Victoria saw several board members exchange glances. Mr. Holden wasn't invited to this meeting, Thomas Lane said coldly. This is a closed board session. Then perhaps you shouldn't have made my personal life a board agenda item. Victoria's voice cut through the room like a blade. Mark is here because you've decided his relationship with me is relevant to my ability to lead this company. If we're going to discuss my judgment, he has a right to hear what's being said. Steele shifted uncomfortably. Miss Lane, this meeting was called to address concerns about leadership stability and decision-making. The photograph that surfaced, your subsequent rejection of Richard Blackwell's proposal, and your decision to pursue a relationship with an employee all raise legitimate questions about your priorities. My priorities are exactly where they've always been. Victoria pulled up her tablet, projecting her quarterly reports onto the screen behind her. In the 3 years since I took over as CEO, Lane Enterprises has grown revenue by 42%, expanded into 4 new markets, and increased shareholder value by over $1 billion. My priorities have created measurable, documentable success for this company. No one's questioning your business acumen, Gerald Morris interjected, though his tone suggested he absolutely was questioning it. We're questioning your judgment, your decision-making process, your ability to separate personal impulses from professional responsibilities. You mean you're questioning whether I'm willing to marry who you tell me to marry? Victoria's voice was sharp. Let's be honest about what this meeting is actually about. You wanted me to accept Richard's proposal because it served the board's interests. I declined because it didn't serve mine. And now you're calling my fitness for leadership into question because I dared to have an opinion about my own life. That's not fair, Richard started, but Victoria cut him off. Isn't it? Tell me, Richard, when you proposed, were you thinking about me as a person or me as a strategic asset? When you picked out that ring, were you imagining a marriage or a merger? She turned back to the board. I appreciate that the Blackwell partnership would have been profitable. I understand the optics you were hoping for. But I'm not a bargaining chip, and my personal life isn't a line item in your corporate strategy. Thomas Lane's expression darkened. This isn't about controlling your personal life, Victoria. This is about the image this company projects, about the values we represent, about maintaining stakeholder confidence in our leadership. Then let's talk about stakeholder confidence. Marcus stood, moving to the front of the room with his own tablet. I've been monitoring social media sentiment since the photo leaked. Do you know what the response has been? Overwhelmingly positive. People are calling Victoria human, relatable, authentic. The narrative isn't CEO makes poor choices, it's CEO chooses love over corporate expectations. That's the kind of story that builds brand loyalty. It's also the kind of story that makes us look weak, Thomas countered, like we're run by emotion instead of strategy. With respect, Mr. Lane, you're wrong. Mark's voice was quiet, but carried through the room. Every head turned to look at him, and Victoria felt him tense beside her, but he didn't back down. The story isn't weakness, it's strength. It's your daughter having the courage to make a choice that serves her happiness, instead of just serving profit margins. And who exactly are you to lecture this board about strength? Steele's voice dripped condescension. You're a maintenance worker who happened to catch the CEO's attention. That doesn't qualify you to comment on corporate leadership. You're right. Mark's calm agreement seemed to throw Steele off balance. I'm not qualified to comment on corporate leadership, but I'm qualified to comment on what it takes to survive tragedy with dignity intact. I'm qualified to talk about making hard choices when every option feels impossible. And I'm qualified to recognize when someone's being punished for having the courage to want more from life than what other people decided they should have. The room went very quiet. Victoria felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion as Mark continued, his voice steady and sure. My wife died 3 years ago. Drunk driver, wrong place, wrong time. And I spent months just going through the motions because feeling anything hurt too much. I took a job that was beneath my education because it had flexible hours and good health insurance for my son. I became invisible because being seen meant being vulnerable. Mark looked at Victoria, and something passed between them. Understanding, recognition, truth. Then Victoria straightened my tie one morning, and for the first time in 3 years, I remembered what it felt like to be actually alive. Not just surviving, but living. And yeah, that scared me. It still scares me. But you know what scares me more? The idea of watching her give up that feeling because a room full of strangers decided her happiness was less important than quarterly projections. The silence that followed was profound. Victoria saw several board members shift uncomfortably, saw others exchange glances that suggested Mark's words had landed harder than expected. Even her father's expression had flickered with something that might have been respect before hardening back into disapproval. "That's a very touching story," Richard said finally, his voice tight. "But it doesn't change the fact that Victoria made this decision impulsively, without considering the broader implications. She rejected a partnership that would have been objectively beneficial for, what, chemistry? A feeling? That's not leadership. That's recklessness." "Is it?" Victoria turned to face Richard directly. "Because from where I'm sitting, accepting your proposal would have been the reckless choice. Committing to a marriage I didn't want, to a partnership that would have made me miserable, just because it looked good on paper. That's not strategic thinking, Richard. That's cowardice." Richard's face flushed with anger. "You're calling me a coward?" "I'm calling myself one." Victoria's voice softened slightly. "Or I was one, until I found the courage to admit what I actually wanted. Richard, you deserve someone who loves you, not someone who chose you because the board said it was good business. You deserve better than that, and so do I." Something flickered across Richard's face. Hurt, maybe, or the first crack in his wounded pride. For a moment, Victoria thought he might actually hear what she was saying. Then his expression hardened again, and he turned to address the board. "Sentiment aside, we still have a fundamental problem. Victoria has initiated a relationship with an employee, which raises serious HR concerns. She's made a decision that's damaged a potential business alliance, and she's demonstrated a pattern of prioritizing personal feelings over corporate interests. Those are legitimate grounds for questioning her leadership." Thomas Lane nodded slowly. "I agree, which is why I'm calling for a vote of no confidence. If the majority of this board agrees that Victoria's recent decisions demonstrate unfitness for continued leadership, we'll begin the process of—" "You can't do that." Marcus's voice was sharp. "Victoria's contract requires cause for removal. Personal relationships don't constitute cause." "A relationship with an employee absolutely constitutes cause if it demonstrates poor judgment and creates liability for the company," Steele argued. "We have grounds, Marcus. We have more than enough grounds." Victoria felt the trap closing around her, felt the careful coalition her father had built preparing to strike. This was it, the moment where years of work, of proving herself, of fighting to be taken seriously would all come crashing down because she dared to want something for herself. Then Mark stood up, and everyone in the room turned to look at him. "I quit," he said simply. Victoria's head whipped around. "What?" "I quit. Effective immediately." Mark looked at the board members one by one. "You're concerned about Victoria having a relationship with an employee? Fine. I'm no longer an employee. Problem solved." "Mark, no," Victoria started, but he gently squeezed her shoulder. "It's already done." His voice was calm, certain. "I was planning to leave anyway. The flexible hours were important when Jamie was younger, but he's 7 now, more independent. I've actually been looking at positions that better use my engineering background. This just accelerates the timeline." "How convenient," Thomas said dryly. "And I suppose you just happen to have other job prospects lined up?" "Actually, yes." Mark pulled out his phone, scrolling to what looked like an email. "I've been in preliminary discussions with Morrison and Associates about a project management position. They're interested in my infrastructure background. The salary's better, the hours are better, and I get to use my actual degree instead of fixing leaky faucets." He looked at Victoria. "I was going to tell you this weekend. Surprise." Victoria stared at him, trying to determine how much of this was true and how much was masterful improvisation. The steady certainty in his eyes suggested it might actually be real, which somehow made everything more complicated and more simple at the same time. So you see, Marcus jumped in, clearly following Mark's lead, there's no employee relationship to concern yourselves with. Victoria is dating a structural engineer who happens to have briefly worked here. That's not a scandal. That's not poor judgment. That's just life. Steele's expression soured. This is all very neat. Too neat. You'll forgive us for being skeptical that Mr. Holden's convenient resignation solves all our concerns. What concerns remain? Victoria demanded, finding her voice again. I've shown you my track record. I've demonstrated consistent growth and profitability. I've explained my personal choices. Mark's no longer an employee. What exactly are you still objecting to? The optics, Thomas said bluntly. A CEO dating someone from such a different social class. Someone with a child from a previous relationship. Someone who brings nothing to the table in terms of business connections or strategic value. The shareholders won't like it, Victoria. The press will have a field day, and the board's reputation will suffer by association. Then maybe the board's reputation needs to suffer. Victoria stood, her voice carrying the kind of authority that had made her successful despite every obstacle they'd thrown in her path. Because you know what? I'm tired of pretending that profit margins matter more than human dignity. I'm tired of treating people as assets instead of individuals. And I'm really tired of being told that my personal happiness is a liability to this company. She moved to the screen, pulling up a different set of data. You want to talk about optics? Let's talk about optics. Our employee satisfaction scores have increased by 30% since I took over. Our retention rates are at an all-time high. Our reputation for ethical business practices has made us the employer of choice in our industry. You know why? Because I've made choices that treat people like they matter. Because I've built a culture that values humanity alongside profitability. And yes, that includes my relationship with Mark, which I'm not going to apologize for or hide. That's all well and good, Morris began, but Victoria wasn't finished. I'm not done. You want to remove me as CEO? Go ahead. Call your vote. But understand what you'll be voting for. You'll be voting to return to the old way of doing business, where people are expendable and personal lives are corporate property. You'll be voting to tell every employee in this company that their humanity matters less than shareholder comfort. And you'll be voting to make Lane Enterprises just another soulless corporation that values profit over everything else. The room was silent. Victoria could feel her heart hammering against her ribs, could feel Mark's steady presence beside her, could feel the weight of decades of family expectations and corporate pressure pressing down on her shoulders. This was the moment. This was where she either won or lost everything. I think we need to hear from some other board members. Marcus's voice broke the tension. We've heard from Mr. Lane, Mr. Steele, Mr. Morris, and Mr. Blackwell. But there are 8 other people at this table who haven't said a word. Maybe they have different perspectives. Attention turned to the quieter board members, the ones who typically let the loudest voices dominate. Victoria watched as Eleanor Chen, one of the board's few women, cleared her throat. I'd like to say something. Chen's voice was measured, thoughtful. I've served on this board for 12 years. I've watched Victoria grow from an uncertain young woman thrust into leadership to one of the most capable CEOs I've had the privilege of working with. And in that time, I've also watched her sacrifice everything personal for this company. Her 20s, her social life, her chance at a normal existence, all given to Lane Enterprises without complaint. Chen looked around the table. So when I see her finally making a choice for herself, finally claiming some piece of personal happiness, my first instinct isn't to punish her for it. My first instinct is to ask why we're so threatened by the idea of our CEO being human. Another board member, David Kim, nodded slowly. Eleanor's right. We've built this narrative that leadership requires complete sacrifice of personal life. But is that actually true? Or is it just what we tell ourselves to justify demanding inhuman levels of dedication? This isn't about demanding dedication, Thomas interjected. This is about maintaining standards. Standards that conveniently only seem to apply to Victoria, Chen interrupted. When Robert Morrison started dating his secretary, we didn't call an emergency board meeting. When Gerald's son joined the company through obvious nepotism, we didn't question his judgment. But Victoria dates someone from outside our social circle, and suddenly we're concerned about standards. The accusation hung in the air, sharp and uncomfortable. Victoria saw several board members shift uncomfortably, saw her father's jaw tighten with barely suppressed anger. "That's completely different," Morris protested. "Morrison's situation didn't involve the CEO position, didn't it? He was vice president at the time, on track for senior leadership, and we gave him a pass because we decided his personal life was his business." Chen's voice was firm. "I'm proposing we extend Victoria the same courtesy we've extended to every male leader in this company's history. Let her do her job. Let her live her life. And judge her on her actual performance, not on who she's sleeping with." The crude bluntness of Chen's final statement seemed to shock the room into silence. Victoria felt heat climb her neck, felt Mark tense beside her. But Chen's expression was unapologetic, challenging. "I'm calling the question," she continued. "All in favor of allowing Victoria to continue as CEO without interference in her personal life, say aye." "Wait," Steele started, but Chen cut him off. "This isn't a vote of no confidence, Harrison. This is a vote of confidence. Either we trust Victoria to lead this company, or we don't. Which is it?" The moment stretched out, taut as a wire. Victoria held her breath as Eleanor Chen's hand rose in the air, then David Kim's, then 3 more board members she'd always considered allies but never quite trusted. 6 votes. She needed 7 for a majority. Marcus's hand went up, expected, but still a relief. 7 votes, a majority. But Victoria could see her father calculating, see the others, who hadn't voted yet, exchanging glances. Then, surprisingly, another hand rose. Patricia Okonkwo, one of the newest board members, a brilliant strategist Victoria had recruited last year against significant opposition from the old guard. "I vote aye," Okonkwo said clearly. "Victoria brought me onto this board specifically because she valued diverse perspectives. I'm not going to repay that trust by demanding she conform to outdated expectations about how female CEOs should behave." 8 votes, more than a majority. Victoria felt something release in her chest, felt the beginning of relief even as she watched her father's expression darken. "This isn't over," Thomas said coldly. 8 votes mean Victoria keeps her position for now. But this board meets quarterly, and we'll be watching every decision, every choice, every indication that personal distractions are interfering with professional judgment. "Watch all you want," Victoria's voice was steady. "I've got nothing to hide and nothing to apologize for." The meeting dissolved into uncomfortable silence as board members began gathering their things. Richard left without looking at Victoria, his wounded pride intact. Her father followed close behind but paused at the door. "You've made a powerful enemy today," Thomas said quietly. "I hope your maintenance worker is worth it." "His name is Mark," Victoria replied. "And yes, he is." After everyone else had filed out, Victoria sank into her chair and pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to process what had just happened. She'd won. Barely, by the thinnest of margins, but she'd won. The relief was overwhelming, dizzying. "Hey," Mark's voice was gentle. "You okay?" Victoria looked up at him, this man who'd walked into corporate warfare without flinching, who'd quit his job to protect her position, who'd stood beside her when he had absolutely nothing to gain from it. "I don't know," she admitted. "I just fought my father for control of my life. I just turned the board against itself. Her voice broke slightly. "I just burned a lot of bridges. Bridges that were leading to places you didn't want to go anyway." Mark pulled up a chair beside her. "For what it's worth. You were incredible in there. I was terrified in there." Victoria felt tears prick her eyes, exhaustion, relief, the emotional aftermath of sustained crisis. "And you quit your job. Mark, you actually quit your job for me. Not just for you." Mark's smile was slight but genuine. "That part about Morrison and Associates? That was actually true. I've been talking to them for a few weeks. The timing just worked out." Victoria let out a startled laugh that was half sob. "So your dramatic resignation was only partly improvised?" "The best strategies are built on truth with a little theatrical timing." Mark reached out, then hesitated, his hand hovering between them. "Can I?" Victoria nodded, and Mark took her hand, his fingers warm and solid and real. They sat like that for a long moment, 2 people who'd just survived something neither had been quite prepared for. "What happens now?" Victoria asked finally. "Now?" Mark squeezed her hand gently. Now you go do that interview with the Business Journal and tell them your version of this story. Now, I go home and explain to my 7-year-old why his dad was photographed with a fancy CEO. Now we figure out if this thing between us is real or if we just got caught up in the drama of fighting your board. The last statement hung in the air, weighted with implications neither of them seemed ready to examine. Victoria looked at their joined hands, at the contrast between her manicured nails and his work-roughened fingers, and tried to figure out what she actually felt beneath the relief and exhaustion. I told you last night that this stopped being fake for me, Mark said quietly. That's still true. But I also know we jumped into this mess before we really knew each other, before we figured out if the connection we felt was real or just convenient. So what are you suggesting? Victoria's voice was carefully neutral. I'm suggesting we actually date. For real this time, no board meetings or corporate strategy involved. Just you and me figuring out if what we have is worth building on. Mark met her eyes. And if it's not, if we decide this was just adrenaline and crisis bonding, then we end it honestly, like adults, and move on with our lives. It was such a reasonable suggestion, so practical and mature, that Victoria found herself wanting to argue against it. Because the truth was, she didn't want practical right now. She wanted to believe that what she felt for Mark was real, that the connection wasn't just manufactured by circumstance, but Mark was right. They needed to figure out what this actually was. Okay, she agreed, let's date. Real dates, real conversations, real figuring out if we actually like each other outside of corporate crisis situations. Good. Mark stood, pulling her up with him. And Victoria? Whatever we figure out, whatever happens next, thank you for giving me a reason to stop being invisible. That matters more than you know. He left before Victoria could respond, leaving her alone in the empty boardroom with her racing thoughts and uncertain heart. She'd won today. She'd kept her position, maintained her autonomy, proven that she could fight for herself. But sitting there in the aftermath, Victoria couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was just beginning. Because fighting the board was easy compared to figuring out her own heart. And she had a sinking suspicion that Mark Holden was going to be a lot more complicated than any corporate merger. The interview with Jennifer Kim from the Chicago Business Journal took place that afternoon in a conference room Victoria had carefully selected for its warm lighting and comfortable atmosphere. Marcus sat in on it, ostensibly as COO, but really as moral support and damage control insurance. Kim was sharp, professional, and clearly thrilled to have landed an exclusive with Chicago's most talked-about CEO. Ms. Lane, thank you for agreeing to this interview. I know it's been a chaotic few days. That's one word for it. Victoria managed a smile that felt almost genuine. But I appreciate the opportunity to set the record straight. Let's start with the obvious question, the photo that sparked all of this. You and Mark Holden in what appeared to be an intimate moment. Can you tell me what was actually happening? Victoria had practiced this answer with Marcus, had refined it until it hit the perfect balance of honest and strategic. Mark and I were having a conversation during a difficult day. The photo captured a private moment between two people who care about each other. Was it the most professional setting? No, but sometimes being human means having emotions that don't fit neatly into board meeting schedules. How long have you and Mr. Holden been together? We met about 4 months ago when he was called to fix an issue in my office. We started talking, discovered unexpected connection, and things developed from there. The timeline they'd established delivered with practiced ease. We kept the relationship private because I valued my privacy and wanted to be sure before going public. Kim nodded, making notes. Mr. Holden was employed by Lane Enterprises until this morning. Doesn't that create ethical concerns? Mark resigned this morning to eliminate any appearance of impropriety. He's accepted a position with Morrison & Associates that better utilizes his engineering background. The relationship was never inappropriate, but we both felt it was important to maintain clear professional boundaries. Your father called an emergency board meeting this morning. Sources say it was to discuss your fitness for leadership. Can you comment on that? Victoria chose her words carefully. The board had concerns about recent events, which is understandable. We had a productive conversation about leadership expectations and personal autonomy. The board voted to support my continued leadership of Lane Enterprises. What about Richard Blackwell? There were reports you were expected to announce your engagement. This was the delicate part. Victoria kept her expression neutral, professional. Richard is a wonderful person and would have been an excellent strategic partner, but I couldn't commit to a marriage based primarily on business considerations. Richard deserves someone who loves him, and I deserve the same. We've parted on respectful terms. Kim leaned forward slightly, sensing the real story. So you chose Mark Holden over Richard Blackwell, over a potential billion-dollar merger. That's a significant decision. I chose authenticity over convenience, Victoria corrected. I chose to build a life based on real connection rather than corporate strategy. And yes, that meant disappointing some people who had different expectations, but I'd rather disappoint others than disappoint myself. The interview continued for another 30 minutes, covering Victoria's vision for Lane Enterprises, her thoughts on work-life balance for corporate leaders, her plans for the coming year. By the time Kim packed up her recorder, Victoria felt wrung out but cautiously optimistic that the narrative was shifting in the right direction. Off the record, Kim said as she gathered her things, I think you're brave. A lot of female executives would have just married the appropriate guy and played the game. It's refreshing to see someone actually make a different choice. After Kim left, Victoria turned to Marcus. How bad was I? You were perfect. Marcus's smile was genuine. You hit every note exactly right. Vulnerable but strong, honest but strategic, human but professional. If this doesn't turn public opinion in your favor, nothing will. And if it doesn't matter, if my father just keeps fighting me every step of the way, Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then you keep fighting back. That's what you've always done, Vic. That's what makes you good at this. Victoria wanted to believe him. She wanted to feel victorious, vindicated, confident in the choices she'd made. Instead, she just felt tired and uncertain and more than a little scared of what came next. Her phone buzzed with a text from Mark. How did the interview go? Victoria typed back, I think I survived it. How did the conversation with Jamie go? The response came quickly. He wants to meet you. Fair warning, he's 7 and has no filter. Be prepared for deeply personal questions about whether you like dinosaurs. Despite everything, Victoria smiled. I'm great with dinosaurs. When? Tomorrow? Dinner at my place? Nothing fancy, just pizza and chaos? Victoria stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. This was it, the transition from corporate crisis to actual relationship. From strategic partnership to real life. From fighting battles together to seeing if they actually worked when there were no battles to fight. Tomorrow sounds perfect, she typed, then added, Fair warning back. I've never had pizza with a 7-year-old before. Be prepared for me to have no idea what I'm doing. Mark's response made her laugh. That makes 2 of us. We'll figure it out together. Together. The word felt both promising and terrifying. Victoria had spent so long fighting alone, being strong alone, making decisions alone, that the idea of actually having someone to figure things out with felt foreign and dangerous, and oddly appealing all at once. She went home that evening to her expensive, empty apartment and tried to imagine what came next. Dating Mark for real, meeting his son, building something genuine instead of strategic, living a life that wasn't carefully choreographed for maximum corporate benefit. It should have felt liberating. Instead, it felt like standing at the edge of a cliff with no idea what lay at the bottom. Victoria stood at her window looking out at the Chicago skyline and tried to remember who she'd been before she became CEO Victoria Lane. The version of herself who'd had dreams beyond quarterly earnings, who'd imagined love as something more than a strategic alliance, who'd believed happiness was possible without sacrifice. That person felt like a stranger now. But maybe, with Mark's help, Victoria could find her way back. Or maybe they'd build someone new together, someone who existed in the space between corporate warrior and actual human being. Her phone rang, interrupting her spiraling thoughts. Unknown number, but Victoria answered anyway, too tired to screen calls. Victoria Lane. Ms. Lane, this is Andrew Morrison from Morrison & Associates. The voice was warm, professional. I hope I'm not calling too late. I wanted to reach out regarding Mark Holden. Victoria's stomach dropped. Is everything okay? More than okay. Mark mentioned he was dating you when we spoke this morning, and I wanted to assure you that his job offer is legitimate and has nothing to do with your relationship. We've been pursuing him for weeks based on his qualifications alone. Morrison paused. I've seen the news coverage, and I wanted you to know that Mark's personal life is his own business. We're excited to have him join our team because he's brilliant, not because of who he's dating. The relief that flooded through Victoria was so profound it almost hurt. Thank you for calling. That means more than you know. Of course. And Miss Lane? For what it's worth, I think what you're doing is admirable. Not many executives have the courage to choose their own path. I hope it works out for both of you. After Morrison hung up, Victoria stood in her empty apartment and felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time in days, maybe years, she felt like she wasn't fighting alone. Like maybe, just maybe, there were people in the world who believed that choosing happiness over strategy wasn't weakness. Like maybe she'd made the right choice after all. Tomorrow, she'd have dinner with Mark and Jamie. Tomorrow, she'd start figuring out if what she felt was real or convenient. Tomorrow, she'd begin the terrifying process of building a life that wasn't carefully curated for corporate consumption. But tonight, Victoria Lane stood at her window and let herself feel something she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. Hope. And this time, she didn't push it away. The hope lasted exactly until Victoria stood outside Mark's apartment building the following evening, clutching a bottle of wine that had cost more than she wanted to admit, and fighting the urge to flee back to the safety of corporate crises she actually knew how to handle. She'd faced down hostile board members, negotiated multi-million-dollar deals, stood up to her father in front of the entire company leadership. But the prospect of having pizza with a 7-year-old terrified her in ways that quarterly earnings reports never could. Victoria pressed the buzzer before she could talk herself out of it. "Come on up," Mark's voice crackled through the intercom, warm with an excitement that made her stomach flip. Third floor, apartment 3B. The building was older, modest, the kind of place where families actually lived instead of just invested. Victoria climbed the stairs. The elevator was apparently broken, a handwritten sign apologetically explaining, and tried to calm her racing heart. This was just dinner, just meeting Mark's son, just the beginning of figuring out if what they'd built in crisis could survive in reality, just potentially the most important evening of her life. Mark opened the door before she could knock, and Victoria's breath caught. He was wearing jeans and a t-shirt that had seen better days, his hair slightly messy, his smile genuine and slightly nervous. He looked nothing like the men she usually dated, the Richards of the world with their expensive cologne and practiced charm. He looked real. "You came," he said, like he'd half expected her to bail. "I came." Victoria held up the wine. "I brought this, though I'm realizing a 7-year-old probably isn't going to appreciate a 2015 Bordeaux. I'll appreciate it enough for both of us." Mark stepped aside to let her in, and Victoria entered a world that was completely foreign to her expensive, minimalist existence. The apartment was small, cluttered in the way that homes with children always were, filled with mismatched furniture and Jamie's artwork covering the refrigerator and the lived-in warmth of people who actually used their space instead of just existing in it. "Dad, is she here?" A small voice called from down the hall, vibrating with barely contained excitement. "Yeah, buddy, come meet her." Jamie appeared around the corner like a tiny tornado, all energy and wild dark hair and eyes that were his mother's, but somehow entirely his own. He skidded to a stop in front of Victoria, studying her with the kind of frank assessment only children could pull off. "You're really pretty," he announced. "Dad said you were pretty, but I thought maybe he was just being nice because he likes you. But you actually are." Victoria felt heat climb her neck. "Thank you. You're pretty handsome yourself." Jamie considered this seriously. "I look like my mom. Dad says that's a good thing because Mom was beautiful." He paused, then added with 7-year-old bluntness, "She died when I was 4. Do you know about that?" "Jamie," Mark started, but Victoria held up a hand. "I do know about that," she said gently, crouching down to Jamie's eye level. "And I'm very sorry that happened to you. It's okay to talk about your mom if you want to." Jamie's expression shifted, surprise maybe, or relief that she hadn't tried to change the subject the way adults usually did. "Most people get weird when I mention her, like they're scared I'm going to cry or something." "Are you going to cry?" "No." Jamie said it with the certainty of someone who'd done enough crying to know the difference between sad and devastated. "I'm just saying she existed, you know? I don't like when people pretend she didn't." Victoria felt something crack open in her chest. I think that's very brave. Your mom was lucky to have a son who remembers her like that. Jamie studied her for another moment, then apparently decided she'd passed some invisible test. Do you like dinosaurs? I don't know much about them, Victoria admitted, but I'm willing to learn. Good, because I'm going to tell you everything during dinner. Dad says I have to let you eat, but also I have a lot of important information about velociraptors that you need to know. Mark cleared his throat, fighting a smile. Maybe let Victoria get settled before you start the Velociraptor lecture series. Jamie nodded seriously. Okay, but we're definitely discussing the Cretaceous period before dessert. He bounded off toward what Victoria assumed was his room, leaving her alone with Mark, who was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Sorry about the third degree, Mark said. Jamie's been excited about meeting you all day. I tried to prepare him for appropriate conversation topics, but subtlety isn't exactly his strong suit. He's wonderful, Victoria meant it, and honest in a way that's actually refreshing. I spend most of my time with people who never say what they really mean. Well, you'll never have that problem with Jamie. Mark moved toward the kitchen, gesturing for her to follow. Fair warning, this is not the kind of dinner you're probably used to. It's frozen pizza and whatever vegetables I can convince Jamie to eat, which tonight appears to be exactly 0 vegetables. Sounds perfect. Victoria settled onto one of the mismatched stools at the small kitchen counter, watching Mark move around the space with easy familiarity. This was his world, small, honest, built on making do rather than having everything. And somehow, Victoria felt more comfortable here than she ever had in her expensive apartment with its designer furniture and carefully curated art. They ate at the small dining table, Jamie wedged between them, delivering his promised lecture on velociraptors with the enthusiasm of someone who'd discovered the most important information in the universe. Victoria found herself genuinely engaged, asking questions, laughing at Jamie's dramatic reenactments of prehistoric hunting strategies. Mark watched them both with an expression that made Victoria's heart do complicated things she wasn't ready to examine. Okay, buddy, Mark said finally, when Jamie's monologue had stretched past an hour. I think Victoria's reached her maximum dinosaur knowledge capacity for one night. But I haven't even told her about the feathers yet, Jamie protested. Tomorrow, Mark promised. Right now, it's bath time. Jamie groaned but didn't argue, apparently familiar enough with his father's routines to know which battles were worth fighting. Will you still be here when I'm done? He asked Victoria. If you want me to be. I want you to be. Jamie said it simply, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. You're nice, and you didn't get bored when I talked about dinosaurs. Dad's last girlfriend got bored after like 5 minutes. Victoria felt Mark tense beside her, but Jamie was already moving toward the bathroom, oblivious to the bomb he'd just dropped. After he disappeared, the silence stretched between Victoria and Mark, suddenly uncomfortable. Last girlfriend? Victoria kept her voice carefully neutral. Mark rubbed the back of his neck, looking embarrassed. There was someone about a year ago. It lasted maybe 3 months before she decided dating a single dad was more complicated than she'd signed up for. Jamie mentioned her because he has absolutely no filter, as you've probably noticed. I've noticed. Victoria took a sip of wine, trying to figure out how she felt about the revelation. Jealous? Relieved that Mark had tried to move on? Worried she'd end up being another person who decided single parenthood was too complicated? What happened? The truth? She wanted me to be available on her schedule, and my schedule revolves around Jamie. When those two things conflicted, which they did constantly, she got frustrated. Mark met Victoria's eyes. I'm not going to apologize for that. Jamie comes first. He always comes first. And if you're not okay with that, we should figure it out now before this goes any further. The directness of the statement should have felt like a challenge. Instead, it felt like honesty, and Victoria found herself respecting Mark even more for laying out the terms so clearly. I don't want you to apologize, she said quietly. Your son should come first. That's what good parents do. She paused, then added, I just want to know if I'm going to be enough. If someone like me, someone who doesn't know anything about dinosaurs or parenting or what it means to build a life around another person, can actually fit into your world. Mark was quiet for a moment, studying her face. Then he reached across the table and took her hand. Victoria, You spent an hour listening to my 7-year-old explain velociraptor hunting patterns with genuine interest. You got down on his level when he mentioned his mom instead of getting uncomfortable. You showed up here tonight even though I could tell you were terrified. You're already fitting into our world better than you think." Victoria felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I'm scared I'm going to mess this up. I'm scared Jamie's going to realize I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm scared that what we felt during all the crisis and drama isn't going to translate to actual relationship when things are calm." "I'm scared too." Mark's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "I'm scared you're going to wake up one day and realize you traded down, gave up billionaire heirs and corporate mergers for frozen pizza and dinosaur lectures. I'm scared the board's going to keep making your life hell, and you're going to resent me for it. I'm scared—" His voice dropped lower. "I'm scared I'm already in too deep to walk away if this doesn't work." The admission hung between them, raw and honest. Victoria looked at their joined hands and tried to remember the last time anyone had been this vulnerable with her, this willing to admit fear alongside hope. "So what do we do?" she asked. "We figure it out one day at a time." Mark's smile was small but genuine. "We have dinners and conversations. We let Jamie get to know you gradually. We see if what we have is strong enough to survive normal life instead of just crisis situations. And if it's not—" He paused, his expression turning serious. "If it's not, we end it honestly before anyone gets hurt worse than necessary." That's a very practical approach to romance. I'm a practical person. Comes with being a single parent. Mark squeezed her hand gently. "But Victoria, I really hope we don't have to end it, because sitting here with you, watching you interact with my son, feeling like maybe I found someone who actually gets what my life is like, this is the most hopeful I've felt in 3 years." Before Victoria could respond, Jamie emerged from the bathroom in dinosaur pajamas, his hair damp and sticking up in directions that defied physics. "Can Victoria read me a bedtime story?" Mark looked at Victoria, clearly giving her an out if she needed it. But Victoria found herself nodding before she could overthink it. "I'd love to." Jamie's room was exactly what she'd expected. Small, chaotic, covered in drawings and toy dinosaurs and the cheerful mess of childhood. He climbed into bed with his stuffed elephant, the one Victoria remembered from that first morning, and patted the space beside him expectantly. Victoria settled onto the edge of the bed, accepting the book Jamie thrust at her. "The Velveteen Rabbit," she read aloud. "Good choice." "It's about becoming real," Jamie explained seriously. "Mom used to read it to me. Dad says it was her favorite." Victoria's throat tightened, but she opened the book and began reading, her voice steady despite the emotion building in her chest. She read about the toy rabbit who wanted to become real, about the boy who loved him despite his shabbiness, about the magic that happened when love transformed something artificial into something genuine. By the time she finished, Jamie's eyes were drooping. "Victoria?" His voice was sleepy, small. "Yes?" "I think you're already real. You don't have to worry about becoming it." The words hit Victoria with unexpected force. She looked down at the 7-year-old who barely knew her, who'd somehow seen past all her corporate armor to something honest underneath, and felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you, Jamie. That might be the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me." "Dad thinks you're real too." Jamie yawned, burrowing deeper into his covers. "I can tell because he smiles different when he talks about you. Like he's happy instead of just pretending to be happy." Victoria brushed Jamie's hair back from his forehead, the gesture feeling natural despite her complete lack of parenting experience. "Get some sleep, buddy. We'll talk more about velociraptors another time." "Promise?" "Promise." She found Mark waiting in the hallway, his expression soft and vulnerable in a way that made her want to both run toward him and run away simultaneously. "He's down," she said quietly. That's an incredible kid you're raising." "He likes you." Mark's voice was rough with emotion. "Really likes you." Which is terrifying because Jamie doesn't like many people. And if this doesn't work out— Victoria cut him off by stepping forward and kissing him. It wasn't strategic or calculated or part of any plan. It was just need. The need to show him that she meant this, that she wasn't going to hurt his son, that what they were building mattered more than quarterly earnings or board votes or anything else that had consumed her life before now. Mark responded immediately, his hands coming up to frame her face as he deepened the kiss. It was different from their careful touches in the storage room, different from the performance of putting his hand on her back during the board meeting. This was real. Messy and honest and completely unscripted. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Mark rested his forehead against hers. "Victoria, I know it's risky," she whispered. "I know we're probably both insane for doing this. But Mark, I don't want to walk away. I don't want to play it safe. I want to figure out if what we have can actually work. Even knowing it's going to be complicated, that my life comes with a 7-year-old and memories of someone I loved and a schedule that revolves around school pickups and bedtime stories? Especially knowing that." Victoria pulled back slightly to meet his eyes. "Because that's real, Mark. That's the kind of life that actually means something. And I've spent so long living a life that looked perfect from the outside but felt empty on the inside. I don't want empty anymore. I want real, even if real is complicated." Mark kissed her again, slower this time, tender in a way that made Victoria's chest ache with the unfamiliarity of being treated like something precious rather than strategic. When he pulled back, his smile was genuine, hopeful. "Stay," he said quietly. "Not for anything, just stay. We'll watch a movie, drink your expensive wine, talk about things that have nothing to do with corporate drama or public pressure. Just be here with me." Victoria stayed. They ended up on Mark's worn couch with the wine she'd brought and a movie neither of them paid attention to, talking about everything and nothing. Mark told her about Sarah, not the tragedy of her death, but the reality of their life together. The college sweethearts who'd figured out adulthood together, the unexpected pregnancy that had terrified and delighted them, the small apartment where they'd built dreams bigger than their circumstances. He talked about her like she was still part of his life, still shaping who he was, and Victoria found herself grateful for it instead of threatened by it. She told him about growing up as Victoria Lane, about the weight of expectations and legacy, about learning early that her value was measured in quarterly earnings rather than personal happiness. She talked about the loneliness of being powerful, the way success had isolated her from anything resembling normal human connection. She admitted fears she'd never voiced to anyone, that she'd become exactly what her father wanted, that she'd sacrificed so much for the company that there was nothing left of the person she might have been. "There's plenty left," Mark said when she finally ran out of words. "I see her, the real you, underneath all the corporate armor. She's still there, Victoria. She just needs permission to exist." The words settled into Victoria's chest like a promise. They fell asleep on the couch sometime after midnight, tangled together in a way that felt both new and somehow inevitable, like puzzle pieces finally clicking into place. Victoria woke to early morning light streaming through unfamiliar windows and Jamie's stage whisper. "Dad, Victoria's still here. Does that mean she's my friend now?" She kept her eyes closed, listening to Mark's soft response. "I think it means she's both our friend, buddy, but we have to give her space to decide how much she wants to be part of our lives, okay? No pressure." "But I want her to stay." Jamie's voice was plaintive, honest. "She's nice, and she didn't think my dinosaur facts were boring, and she read to me like Mom used to. Can't we just keep her?" Victoria felt her throat tighten. She opened her eyes to find both Holden men watching her, Mark with careful hope, Jamie with uninhibited enthusiasm. "Good morning," she managed, her voice rough with sleep and emotion. "Morning," Mark said softly. "Sorry if we woke you. Someone doesn't understand the concept of letting guests sleep." "I understand it," Jamie protested. "I just think Victoria would rather be awake so we can have pancakes together." But despite everything, the complicated logistics of their relationship, the pressure from the board, the uncertainty of what came next, Victoria smiled. "Pancakes sound perfect." They spent the morning in comfortable domesticity that should have felt foreign, but somehow didn't. Victoria helped Jamie pour pancake batter while Mark supervised, watched father and son move around each other with practiced ease, felt herself slowly relaxing into the rhythm of their world. It was so different from her usual mornings. No urgent emails, no crisis management, no performance for corporate consumption. Just breakfast and laughter and the simple magic of being present. Her phone buzzed around 9, shattering the peaceful bubble. "Marcus, turn on the news. The Business Journal article just went live. Victoria's stomach dropped. She'd almost forgotten about the interview, about the narrative they were trying to control. Mark must have seen something in her expression because he immediately moved closer, his hand finding hers. What's wrong? The article about us is out. Victoria pulled up the Chicago Business Journal on her phone, her heart hammering as she scanned the headline. Lane Enterprises CEO chooses heart over merger. Victoria Lane on finding love outside the boardroom. She read quickly, her anxiety slowly transforming into cautious relief. The article was good, better than good. It portrayed Victoria as human rather than calculating, painted Mark as genuine rather than opportunistic, framed their relationship as a modern love story about choosing authenticity over expectation. There were quotes from the board members who'd supported her, testimonials from Lane Enterprises employees praising her leadership, even a surprisingly gracious statement from Richard Blackwell wishing them well. It's good, she said aloud, almost disbelieving. Marcus, it's actually good. Marcus's response came immediately. Told you, the narrative is shifting in your favor. Social media's eating it up. Hashtags about choosing love, memes about corporate romance, the whole works. You're trending for the right reasons. Victoria should have felt relieved. This was what they'd wanted. Public opinion supporting her choices, validation that she'd made the right call. But sitting in Mark's kitchen with pancakes and dinosaur pajamas and the domestic warmth she'd never experienced, Victoria realized the article didn't matter nearly as much as she'd thought it would. The board's approval, the shareholders' comfort, even her father's acceptance. None of it mattered compared to the feeling of Jamie's small hand tugging on her sleeve, asking if she wanted to see his dinosaur collection. Yes, she told Jamie, setting down her phone. I would love to see your dinosaur collection. Mark caught her eye over Jamie's head, his expression asking if she was okay. Victoria nodded, and she meant it. She was more than okay. She was present, engaged, real in a way she hadn't been in years. The rest of the weekend passed in a blur of normalcy that felt revolutionary. Victoria stayed at Mark's apartment, sleeping on the couch despite his offers to take it himself, waking to Jamie's enthusiastic breakfast requests and Mark's coffee that was too strong but somehow exactly right. They went to the park, where Victoria learned that 7-year-olds had boundless energy and no concept of personal dignity when it came to playground equipment. She got grass stains on her expensive jeans and didn't care. She laughed until her stomach hurt watching Mark try to navigate the monkey bars. She felt for the first time in longer than she could remember like a person instead of a position. Monday morning arrived with the inevitability of reality reasserting itself. Victoria had to return to her apartment, to her office, to the corporate world that had temporarily receded but never really disappeared. Mark had to start his new position at Morrison & Associates. Jamie had school. Normal life resumed, except nothing felt quite normal anymore. Victoria walked into Lane Enterprises bracing for judgment, for whispers and speculations, and carefully disguised hostility. What she found instead was surprising. People smiled at her in the hallways. Her assistant greeted her with genuine warmth instead of professional distance. Even the facilities staff, Mark's former colleagues, gave her respectful nods that suggested approval rather than resentment. Marcus appeared in her doorway within minutes of her arrival, his grin wide and victorious. Have you seen the shareholder response to the Business Journal article? I've been avoiding my email all weekend. Victoria settled behind her desk, trying to reacclimate to the space that suddenly felt simultaneously familiar and foreign. How bad is it? It's not bad. It's incredible. Marcus pulled up his tablet, showing her charts and graphs that Victoria's CEO brain immediately started parsing. Shareholder sentiment is up 15%. Brand favorability is at an all-time high. We're getting inquiries from potential partners who specifically mentioned being impressed by your authentic leadership style. Vic, you're not just surviving this, you're winning. Victoria stared at the numbers, trying to process what they meant. She'd expected backlash, consequences, punishment for choosing personal happiness over corporate strategy. Instead, she was being rewarded for it. The world had shifted while she wasn't looking, and somehow she'd ended up on the right side of the shift. What about the board? She asked. My father? Marcus's expression sobered slightly. Your father's been quiet. Too quiet. But the rest of the board seems satisfied for now. You've got breathing room, Vic. Use it wisely. The breathing room lasted exactly 3 weeks. 3 weeks of Victoria carefully balancing her CEO responsibilities with her growing relationship with Mark and Jamie. 3 weeks of learning how to exist in both worlds simultaneously. Corporate powerhouse by day, girlfriend, and tentative parental figure by evening. 3 weeks of believing maybe, just maybe, she could have both. Then her father called an informal dinner meeting, and Victoria knew the other shoe was about to drop. She met Thomas Lane at the same exclusive club where she'd had dinner with Richard a lifetime ago. Her father was already waiting, scotch in hand, his expression unreadable as she approached. "Victoria, thank you for coming." "Did I have a choice?" She settled into the chair across from him, declining the offered drink. She wanted to be clear-headed for whatever was coming. Thomas studied her for a long moment. "You look different. Happier, maybe. Or at least less like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders." "I feel different." Victoria kept her voice neutral, waiting for the attack she knew was coming. "The board's satisfied for now," Thomas said abruptly. "Your numbers are good. Public sentiment is positive. There's no immediate crisis to justify further action against your position. You've won this round, Victoria." "Then why do I feel like you're about to tell me I've lost something else?" Her father's smile was thin, almost sad. "Because you have. You've lost my support, my guidance, my belief that you understand what's actually required to lead this company into the future." The words should have hurt. Victoria had spent her entire life seeking her father's approval, measuring herself against his impossible standards, trying to prove she was worthy of the Lane name. But sitting across from him now, listening to him withdraw his support like it was a business decision, she felt mostly relief. "I'm okay with that," she said quietly. Thomas's eyebrows rose. "You're okay with alienating your father? With losing the one person who's been in your corner since you took over?" "You were never in my corner, Dad. You were in the company's corner. And when those two things conflicted, when I dared to want something for myself that didn't serve corporate interests, you chose the company." Victoria kept her voice level, factual. "I'm not angry about it. I understand it. But I'm also done trying to earn approval I'm never going to get unless I sacrifice everything that makes me human." "That's not fair, isn't it?" Victoria leaned forward slightly. "Tell me honestly, if I'd married Richard, if I'd made the strategic choice instead of the authentic one, would we be having this conversation? Would you be withdrawing your support, or would you be congratulating me on my pragmatism?" Thomas was quiet, which was answer enough. Victoria stood, suddenly tired of performing this dance. "I love you, Dad. I respect what you built and what you tried to teach me. But I'm not going to become you. I'm not going to sacrifice my entire life for quarterly earnings and shareholder comfort. I'm going to lead this company my way. And if that's not good enough for you, then I guess we'll both have to live with that." She turned to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, I think I'm a better CEO now than I was before Mark, because I remember what it's like to be human, to make choices based on what feels right instead of what looks right. And that makes me better at leading people who are also trying to be human while surviving corporate life." "Victoria." Her father's voice stopped her. "You really love him? This maintenance worker with the child and the complicated history?" Victoria turned back, meeting her father's eyes. "His name is Mark. He's a structural engineer starting a new position that better uses his education. He's a devoted father raising an incredible kid. He's the first person in years who's made me feel like I matter as a human being instead of as a corporate asset. So yes, Dad, I really love him." The admission came out before she'd fully processed it herself. But once the words were spoken, Victoria knew they were true. She loved Mark Holden, loved his steady presence, his fierce protectiveness of Jamie, his ability to see her as more than her position. Loved the way he'd walked into her corporate crisis without flinching, the way he challenged her to be brave, the way he made breakfast on Sunday mornings feel like the most important meeting of the week. She loved him, and that changed everything. Thomas Lane studied his daughter for a long moment, his expression cycling through surprise, resignation, and something that might have been grudging respect. "Then I hope he's worth it," he said finally, "because you've bet your legacy on him, Victoria. Don't let me be right about this being a mistake." Victoria left the restaurant with her hands shaking and her heart pounding, but for the first time in her life, she felt completely certain about a choice she'd made. She loved Mark. And whether her father approved or not, whether the board supported her or not, whether the shareholders understood or not, that was real, and real was worth fighting for. She drove straight to Mark's apartment, not bothering to call ahead, needing to see him with an urgency that surprised her. He answered the door in sweatpants and a t-shirt, his hair messy and his expression shifting from surprise to concern when he saw her face. "Victoria? What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." She stepped inside, not waiting for an invitation. "Is Jamie asleep?" "Yeah, just put him down 20 minutes ago. Why?" Victoria kissed him, pouring everything she'd just realized into the contact. Mark responded immediately, his arms coming around her, pulling her close as he kissed her back with equal intensity. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Mark searched her face with worried eyes. "What happened?" "I had dinner with my father. He told me he's withdrawing his support because I chose you over corporate strategy." Victoria's voice was steady, certain. "And I told him I was okay with that. Because, Mark, I love you. I love your son. I love the life you've built and the person I get to be when I'm with you. And I don't care if the board approves or my father understands or the shareholders think I'm making a mistake. I love you, and that's the only thing that actually matters." Mark stared at her, his expression cycling through shock, hope, and something that looked almost like fear. "Victoria, you don't have to say it back," she added quickly. "I know it's fast. I know we're still figuring things out. I just needed you to know that for me, this stopped being about strategy or convenience or solving corporate problems. This is real, and I'm all in." Mark was quiet for a long moment, his hands framing her face as he studied her eyes. Then, slowly, his smile grew into something radiant and genuine. "You love me. I love you. You love my son. I love your son. You're willing to deal with my impossible schedule and the memories of Sarah and the fact that I come as a package deal with a 7-year-old who thinks velociraptors are the most important topic of conversation. All of it. I want all of it." Victoria felt tears prick her eyes. "Mark, I spent my entire life trying to be perfect according to someone else's definition, and then you straightened my tie and looked at me like I was real. And I remembered what it felt like to want something just because I wanted it, not because it made strategic sense. I want you. I want this. And I'm not going anywhere." Mark kissed her again, tender and deep, and when he pulled back, his own eyes were suspiciously bright. "I love you too," he said quietly. "I've been trying not to, trying to be practical and protective of myself and Jamie. But Victoria, I fell in love with you somewhere between that storage room conversation and watching you listen to dinosaur facts like they were the most fascinating thing you'd ever heard. You make me brave enough to believe in second chances." They stood there in Mark's small apartment, holding each other like lifelines, and Victoria felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. This was what mattered. Not board votes or shareholder approval or her father's blessing. This, the solid warmth of Mark's embrace, the quiet sound of Jamie sleeping in the next room, the feeling of being seen and loved exactly as she was. The next few months unfolded like a dream Victoria kept waiting to wake from. She and Mark navigated their relationship with increasing confidence, learning each other's rhythms and establishing new patterns. Victoria started leaving work at reasonable hours, prioritizing dinner with Mark and Jamie over late-night email sessions. She taught Jamie about constellations one night when they couldn't sleep, and he taught her the difference between carnivores and herbivores with the enthusiasm of someone sharing state secrets. She attended school plays and parent-teacher conferences and slowly transformed from dad's girlfriend to something that felt more like family. The board continued their quarterly meetings, watching Victoria with varying degrees of approval and skepticism. But her numbers stayed strong, the company continued growing, and slowly even her harshest critics had to admit that her personal choices hadn't destroyed her professional judgment. Marcus became a regular fixture at Sunday dinners, charming Jamie with magic tricks, and providing adult conversation when Victoria needed reminding that the corporate world still existed. Her mother called eventually, months after the initial crisis, her voice careful and uncertain in ways Constance Lane's voice never was. "Your father told me what you said at dinner, about loving Mark." "I do love him, Mother." "I know." Constance was quiet for a moment. "I want to meet him, and Jamie. properly this time, not in the middle of corporate warfare. The dinner happened on a neutral Sunday, Mark and Jamie arriving at Victoria's apartment with the nervous energy of people entering foreign territory. Constance was surprisingly warm, asking Jamie about school and dinosaurs with genuine interest, treating Mark with respect instead of condescension. Over dessert, she pulled Victoria aside. "I was wrong," Constance said quietly. "About Richard? About what you needed? About thinking strategic partnerships were enough. Your father and I—" She paused, her carefully composed expression cracking slightly. "We built something together, but we also lost something. And watching you with Mark, seeing how you light up around him, I remember feeling that way once, before I decided duty mattered more than joy." "Mom, let me finish." Constance took a breath. "I want you to have what your father and I gave up. I want you to believe that love and success can coexist. And I want you to know that I'm proud of you for being braver than I ever was." Victoria hugged her mother, feeling decades of tension finally release. They weren't fixed, families never were, but they were honest, and honest was a start. 6 months after that first board meeting, Victoria stood in Mark's apartment helping Jamie with his homework, when Mark cleared his throat nervously. "Hey buddy, can I borrow Victoria for a minute?" Jamie looked up from his math problems. "Are you going to do mushy stuff? Because I have opinions about the appropriate time and place for mushy stuff." "When did you become an expert on mushy stuff?" Mark ruffled Jamie's hair. "Television. It's very educational." Jamie returned to his homework with the air of someone who'd said his piece. Mark led Victoria to the small balcony, the Chicago skyline spread out before them like promise. He took both her hands, his expression nervous and hopeful in equal measure. "I've been thinking about something," he started, then paused, clearly gathering courage. "About how you walked into my life and changed everything. About how you made me believe in second chances and new beginnings. About how Jamie lights up every time you walk in the door. About how you're already family in every way that matters." Victoria's heart started hammering. "Mark, let me finish before I lose my nerve." Mark smiled, still holding her hands. "I don't have an expensive ring or a perfectly choreographed proposal. I'm not a billionaire heir who can offer you strategic partnerships and corporate alliances, but I can offer you Sunday pancakes and dinosaur lectures and a 7-year-old who adores you. I can offer you a life that's messy and complicated and completely real. Victoria Lane, will you marry me?" Victoria felt tears stream down her face. Happy tears, overwhelmed tears, the tears of someone who'd finally found what she didn't know she was looking for. "Yes," she managed. "Yes, absolutely, yes." Mark kissed her as the city lights sparkled around them, and Victoria heard Jamie's voice drift from inside. "Are you guys done being mushy yet? Because I have important homework questions, and also I want to know if Victoria saying yes means I get to call her mom eventually, or if that's weird." They broke apart laughing, and Victoria realized this was it. This was the life she'd been fighting for without knowing it. Not perfect, not strategic, not carefully curated for maximum corporate benefit. Just real, messy, honest love, with a man who saw her and a child who'd decided she belonged. The wedding happened 4 months later, small and intimate in the same park where Victoria had learned about playground equipment and grass stains. Jamie stood between them as they exchanged vows, his small hand in Victoria's, his smile bright enough to rival the autumn sun. Marcus served as best man, making a speech that had everyone laughing and crying in equal measure. Even Victoria's parents came, her father still distant but present, her mother dabbing at tears she'd probably deny later. Victoria had thought her life changed the day Mark straightened his tie, but standing there in a simple dress, saying vows that were honest instead of strategic, promising forever to a man who'd taught her the difference between surviving and living, this was when everything truly began. The board continued their meetings. Lane Enterprises continued thriving. Victoria continued leading with the same fierce competence she'd always had, except now tempered with the kind of humanity that made her employees actually want to follow her vision. She proved that loving someone didn't make her weak. It made her stronger, more grounded, more capable of understanding that business was ultimately about people, and people needed leaders who remembered how to be human. Mark thrived at Morrison & Associates, his engineering skills finally being used properly. He came home most evenings with stories about bridge specifications, and infrastructure projects that Victoria found surprisingly engaging, mostly because of the way his eyes lit up when he talked about work that actually challenged him. Jamie grew into a remarkable kid who could discuss both velociraptors and quarterly earnings with equal enthusiasm, having absorbed knowledge from both his parents with the sponge-like efficiency of childhood. He'd started calling Victoria Mom about 6 months after the wedding, testing the word carefully before deciding it fit. Victoria had cried for an hour the first time he said it casually, like it was the most natural thing in the world. One morning, almost 2 years after Victoria had first straightened Mark's tie, she woke in their home. They'd bought a house together, something bigger than Mark's apartment but smaller than Victoria's former penthouse, a compromise that suited their blended life, and found Mark already awake, watching her with that same look he'd had in the storage room. Recognition, wonder, love. "What?" she mumbled, still half asleep. "Your tie's crooked," Mark said, his voice warm with affection and memory. Victoria looked down at her pajamas, decidedly tie-free. "I'm not wearing a tie." "I know, but if you were, it would definitely be crooked, and I'd definitely straighten it, and you'd definitely stop breathing for a second because that's what you do when I touch you there." Mark's smile was teasing, intimate. Some things never change. Victoria reached for him, pulling him close, feeling his heartbeat steady against her palm. "Good," she whispered. "I never want that to change." Jamie appeared in their doorway, already dressed for school, his backpack dragging behind him. "Are you guys being mushy again? Because we're going to be late, and I have a presentation on the Triassic period that I've been preparing for weeks and cannot miss." "Wouldn't dream of making you miss the Triassic period," Mark said solemnly, extracting himself from Victoria's embrace. "Give us 5 minutes." After Jamie left, Victoria sat up, reaching for Mark's hand. "Do you ever regret it? Giving up your invisible life for all this chaos?" Mark's answer was immediate, certain. "Never. You made me real, Victoria. You reminded me that survival with dignity and tact meant actually living, not just going through the motions. I choose this chaos every single day. Even when my board's being difficult? Especially then. Someone's got to keep you grounded when you're busy being a corporate warrior." Mark kissed her forehead. "Now come on. We've got a 7-year-old with a dinosaur presentation to support." They moved through their morning routine, the careful choreography of family life that they'd built together over 2 years. Victoria fixed breakfast while Mark made lunches. Jamie practiced his presentation at the kitchen table, his enthusiasm undimmed by repetition. They argued amiably about whose turn it was to do drop-off, eventually settling on Victoria taking the morning while Mark handled pickup. Standing in their kitchen, surrounded by the comfortable chaos of family life, Victoria thought about that moment 2 years ago when she'd straightened Mark's tie. She'd been so focused on control then, on managing every detail of her life according to someone else's expectations. She'd been surviving with dignity, just like Mark had said, but not really living. Now she was living with a vengeance, building a life that didn't make strategic sense, that wouldn't impress her father's generation of business leaders, that looked nothing like what she'd been told success should look like. But it was real, messy, honest, and entirely hers. Victoria drove Jamie to school, listening to his last-minute presentation notes with genuine interest. She kissed his forehead before he bounded out of the car, watching him join his friends with the easy confidence of a child who knew he was loved. Then she headed to Lane Enterprises, ready to tackle whatever challenges the day brought, secure in the knowledge that she had something real to come home to. The board meetings continued. The corporate battles kept coming. The pressure and expectations never fully disappeared. But Victoria had learned something her father never understood, that being human didn't make her weak, that loving Mark and Jamie didn't diminish her leadership, that choosing authenticity over strategy hadn't destroyed her career. It had saved it by reminding her why she'd wanted to lead in the first place. At the end of the day, Victoria left her corner office and drove back to the house she shared with Mark and Jamie. She found them in the kitchen, Mark attempting to supervise Jamie's homework while simultaneously preparing dinner, both of them gesturing wildly as they debated the finer points of some dinosaur-related controversy. They looked up when she entered, and both faces lit up with matching smiles that made Victoria's heart swell with gratitude. "How was the presentation?" she asked Jamie. "Perfect. Ms. Rodriguez said it was the most detailed discussion of Triassic period flora and fauna she'd ever heard from a second grader." That's my boy? Victoria ruffled his hair, then moved to Mark, who was watching her with that expression that still made her breath catch after 2 years. Your tie is crooked, she said softly, reaching for his collar, even though he wasn't wearing one. Mark caught her hand, bringing it to his lips. Some things never change. Good, Victoria whispered, meaning it with every fiber of her being. I never want them to. And standing there in their kitchen with the smell of dinner cooking and Jamie's homework spread across the table and Mark's hand warm in hers, Victoria Lane understood something fundamental. She'd spent years trying to survive with dignity and tact, building walls to protect herself from feeling too much. But real dignity, the kind worth having, came from being brave enough to feel everything, to love without reservation, to choose authenticity even when it scared her. She'd straightened Mark's tie that first morning, thinking it was a small gesture, a momentary kindness in an otherwise carefully controlled life. She hadn't known she was reaching toward her own salvation, toward a life that would demand she give up control and embrace chaos and learn that the most strategic thing she could do was stop being strategic and just be human. But she knew it now. And every morning when Mark fixed her coffee exactly right, when Jamie brought her drawings of velociraptors to hang in her office, when she walked into board meetings carrying the confidence of someone who knew what actually mattered, she knew. The tie had been crooked, and in straightening it, Victoria had straightened something in herself that had been bent for far too long. She was real now, completely, messily, beautifully real. And breathing had never felt easier.